More than 2,500 years ago, one empire ruled a territory larger than any the world had ever seen. Its kings controlled lands from Egypt to India, from the mountains of Central Asia to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Yet this empire did something unusual. It collapsed again and again, conquered by Greeks, by Arabs, by Mongols, and yet the civilization beneath it never truly disappeared. This is the story of Persia. Across the mountains of Iran, the wind has been moving across the same valleys for thousands of years. The Zagros Mountains rise slowly above the horizon. Their stone ridges stretch for more than 1,000 miles, casting long shadows across the dry plateau below. In the early morning, the desert is quiet. Only the sound of wind moving gently across the sand. But this quiet land holds one of the longest stories in human history. For more than 2,500 years, great empires have risen here. Kings ruled from magnificent capitals. Armies marched across deserts and mountains, and cities filled with traders, scholars, and travelers from distant lands. This was Persia, one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Its power once stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to the valleys of India, from the steppes of Central Asia to the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. But Persia's story is not only a story of power, it is also a story of survival. Again and again, the empire collapsed. Invaders arrived from every direction. Greek armies crossed the sea. Arab warriors rode out from the desert. Turkic tribes moved down from the steppes, and Mongol horsemen thundered across Asia. Cities burned, dynasties vanished, entire kingdoms disappeared from history. Yet somehow, Persia endured. Something unusual happened here. Instead of destroying Persian civilization, many of the conquerors slowly became part of it. They adopted Persian language, Persian art, Persian traditions of government, and in time, they ruled their new empires as Persian kings. Few civilizations in the world have shown such resilience. Few have survived so many collapses, and yet continued to shape the cultures around them. Tonight, we will travel slowly through this long story, across deserts and mountains, through forgotten capitals and ancient roads, from the first farming villages hidden among the Zagros Mountains, to the great imperial cities of Persepolis and Isfahan. This is the long history of Persia, a story of empire, collapse, rebirth, and survival. Before we continue, take a moment to settle in. Maybe dim the lights around you, or simply close your eyes for a moment. These long journeys through history are designed to be calm, slow, and relaxing. And if you enjoy peaceful historical storytelling like this, you can gently support the channel by subscribing. It truly helps the channel continue creating these long historical documentaries. Now, let the world grow quiet around you, and together, we will travel back across the centuries. Long before Persia became an empire, this land was already ancient. The Iranian Plateau sits at the crossroads of continents. To the west lie the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia. To the east stretch the wide plains of Central Asia. To the north, towering mountains guard the southern edge of the Caspian Sea. And to the south, warm winds blow across the waters of the Persian Gulf. For thousands of years, people have crossed this land. Some arrived as traders, carrying rare goods along narrow mountain paths. Some arrived as migrants, searching for new pastures and water, and others came as conquerors, marching with armies across deserts and valleys. But the land itself has always shaped those who live here. Much of the plateau is dry, rain is uncertain. Summers can be harsh and unforgiving. Yet hidden among the mountains, small rivers flow down into narrow valleys, and wherever water appears, life slowly begins. Long before the first Persian kings, Small farming communities were already growing in these valleys. Their houses were simple: mud brick walls, flat roofs made from timber and clay. Inside, families gathered around small hearths. Outside, fields of barley and wheat stretched beside narrow streams. Goats wandered across rocky hillsides. Children carried water in clay jars, and the rhythm of life followed the seasons: spring planting, summer heat, autumn harvest, winter winds sweeping across the plateau. It was a quiet world, a world of villages, of farmers and shepherds. Yet, even in these early centuries, this land was not isolated. Paths crossed the mountains. Trade moved slowly between valleys. Stone tools traveled from distant regions. Shell beads arrived from faraway seas. Ideas, like the caravans that carried them, moved slowly across the plateau. Over many centuries, villages grew larger. Communities became more organized. Trade became more common, and the foundations of future civilizations slowly began to appear. None of these early villagers could have imagined that their homeland would one day become the center of one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. But history often begins quietly, not with armies, not with kings, but with small communities learning how to live with the land around them. And it is here, among the first villages of the Iranian Plateau, that the long story of Persia truly begins. To understand how Persia emerged, we must begin with these early settlements, with the first farmers, the first villages, and the first communities that appeared among the mountains of Iran. Because long before empires, long before great capitals like Persepolis or Isfahan, there was only the land, and the people who slowly learned how to live upon it. The Iranian Plateau is a land shaped by mountains. Across much of this region, the land rises high above the surrounding world. Wide plains stretch between long mountain chains, and in many places, the horizon seems to continue endlessly beneath a pale sky. To the west, the Zagros Mountains form a rugged barrier of stone. Their ridges run for more than 1,000 miles, separating the plateau from the fertile lands of Mesopotamia. In winter, snow gathers along their peaks. In spring, water from melting ice flows down into the valleys. These small streams bring life to the land, and wherever water appears, people have always followed. Thousands of years ago, long before the first Persian kings, small groups of people began to settle along these valleys. At first, their communities were very small, perhaps only a few families living together. Their homes were simple: walls built from packed earth, roofs made from wood, reeds, and clay. Inside, a single room often served many purposes: a place to sleep, a place to cook, a place where families gathered around a small fire during cold evenings. Life here required patience. The land was not always generous. Rainfall could be uncertain, and the summers were often dry and hot. But the early inhabitants of the plateau slowly learned how to live with the rhythm of this landscape. They planted barley and wheat in narrow fields near streams. They gathered wild plants growing along the hills, and they raised small herds of animals. Goats were among the most important. Their bones appear frequently in ancient archaeological sites. Goats could survive on rough mountain grass. They provided milk, meat, and thick wool that helped families survive cold winters. Day after day, shepherds guided their animals along rocky slopes, returning in the evening to stone pens beside the village homes. These small routines, repeated over generations, began to shape a new way of life. For much of human history, people had lived as hunters and gatherers. They moved frequently, following migrating animals, searching for seasonal plants. But on the Iranian plateau, something slowly changed. Communities began to stay in one place. They built homes meant to last many years. They stored grain in clay containers, and they began to plan their lives around the seasons of planting and harvest. This change did not happen quickly. It unfolded across many centuries. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of these early settlements in several parts of western Iran. One of the most well-known sites is called Ganjdara. There, researchers discovered stone foundations of ancient homes. Inside the soil, they found grinding stones used for preparing grain, animal bones from domesticated goats, and fragments of pottery that once held food and water. These discoveries tell us something important. Even thousands of years ago, people here had already begun to develop complex knowledge about their environment. They understood when to plant crops, how to store food for the winter, and how to manage small herds of animals through changing seasons. Life in these villages was quiet, but it was not isolated. Paths connected one settlement to another. Travel between valleys was slow, but it happened often enough to exchange goods and ideas. Obsidian stone tools have been found in places where the volcanic rock does not naturally exist. This means traders carried them from distant mountains. Shell beads have also appeared in settlements far from the sea. These shells may have traveled hundreds of miles before reaching the plateau. Even in these early centuries, people were already part of a wider network of exchange. Caravans would not appear until much later, but the earliest forms of trade were already beginning. Ideas traveled along these same paths. New farming techniques, new tools, new forms of pottery. And slowly, communities became more organized. Villages grew slightly larger. Some developed small storage buildings for grain. Others created shared spaces where families gathered for ceremonies or seasonal celebrations. Life still moved slowly. Days were guided by the rising and setting of the sun. Children learned from their parents how to plant fields, how to shape clay into vessels, how to guide animals across steep hillsides. Generations passed, and with each generation, knowledge accumulated. People understood their land better. They learned where water flowed most reliably, where crops grew best, which animals were easiest to raise. The plateau itself remained quiet and vast. But beneath this quiet surface, something important was taking shape. Agriculture allowed communities to grow. Trade created connections between valleys, and stable villages slowly laid the foundations for something new. Over time, some settlements began to grow larger than others. More homes appeared, more storage rooms for grain, more people arriving from surrounding areas. These growing settlements would eventually become the earliest towns of the region, and from towns, cities would one day emerge. But that transformation still lay far in the future. For now, the Iranian plateau remained a land of villages. At dawn, smoke rose gently from cooking fires. Shepherds guided goats along mountain paths. Farmers walked quietly through fields of barley moving in the wind. Above them, the mountains stood silent and ancient, watching over a land that was slowly preparing for a much larger story. Because while these villages were growing among the Zagros valleys, powerful civilizations were already flourishing not far away. To the west, in the rich floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, great cities had begun to rise. Their temples towered above crowded streets. Their rulers commanded armies and trade networks that stretched across the ancient Near East. These cities would soon begin to influence the lands beyond the mountains. Trade routes would expand. Cultural ideas would travel further. And eventually, one of the earliest great civilizations of the Iranian plateau would emerge. Its center was a city that would become famous across the ancient world, a city called Susa. And the people who built it, he would be known as the civilization of Elam. Their story is where the history of Persia truly begins. Long before the Persian Empire, long before the names of Cyrus or Darius appeared in history, another civilization already stood on the Iranian plateau. Its center was a city called Susa. Today, Susa lies as quiet ruins in southwestern Iran. Low hills of earth and broken stone stretch across the plain. But thousands of years ago, this place was alive with activity. Caravans arrived from distant lands. Merchants traded goods in busy markets, and rulers governed one of the earliest civilizations of the Iranian world. The people who built this society are known today as the Elamites. Their civilization began more than 5,000 years ago, around the 4th millennium before the Common Era. Settlements in this region began to grow into cities. Susa became the most important among them. The city stood near the edge of the fertile plains that connect the Iranian plateau to Mesopotamia. This location was important because Mesopotamia, to the west, was already home to some of the world's earliest great civilizations. Cities like Uruk, and later Babylon were rising along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These cities needed resources: stone, timber, precious metals. Many of those materials were scarce in the river valleys, but they could be found in the mountains of the Iranian plateau. And so trade routes began to form. Caravans moved slowly between Susa and the cities of Mesopotamia. Donkeys carried goods across dusty roads. Traders exchanged metal ores, fine textiles, pottery, and agricultural products. Through this trade, Susa became a meeting place between worlds. Ideas traveled alongside goods, writing systems, art styles, administrative techniques. Yet the Elamites were never simply imitators of Mesopotamia. They developed their own culture, their own language, and their own traditions of kingship. One of the most intriguing aspects of Elamite society was the position of women. In many surviving artworks and inscriptions, queens appear alongside kings, sometimes even sharing equal prominence in official imagery. This suggests that royal women held significant authority within the court. Some historians believe that certain Elamite dynasties even traced inheritance through the maternal line. While the details remain debated, the archaeological evidence suggests a society where royal women played an unusually visible role in governance. The city of Susa itself grew steadily. At its center stood temples dedicated to the gods. Around them rose administrative buildings where officials managed trade and collected tribute. Beyond the central district, houses spread outward across the plain. Narrow streets connected neighborhoods filled with craftsmen, potters shaping clay vessels, metal workers casting tools and ornaments, textile makers weaving cloth from wool. The rhythms of daily life in Susa would have been familiar in many ways. Markets opened in the morning. Farmers arrived with grain and produce from nearby fields. Merchants weighed goods on simple balances. Children played along the edges of crowded streets. But life in the ancient world was never entirely peaceful. The Elamites shared borders with powerful neighbors, and relations with the cities of Mesopotamia were often tense. At times, trade flourished between the two regions. At other times, war erupted. Armies marched across the plains. Cities were attacked, and control of valuable territories shifted repeatedly. These conflicts appear frequently in the historical records of Mesopotamian kings. Many of them describe campaigns against Elam, and Elamite rulers conducted their own campaigns westward. The balance of power changed again and again across the centuries. Yet, despite these struggles, Elam remained remarkably resilient. Dynasties rose and fell, but the civilization endured for more than 2,000 years. Elamite kings ruled their lands from cities like Susa and Anshan. One of the most famous moments in this long history occurred during the 12th century BCE. An Elamite king named Shutruk-Nahunte launched a powerful campaign into Mesopotamia. His armies captured several important cities, and from those cities, he brought home famous monuments as trophies of victory. One of those monuments still survives today. It is known as the Stele of Hammurabi. Originally erected in Babylon by the famous King Hammurabi, the monument contained one of the earliest known legal codes. After capturing Babylon, the Elamites carried the stone monument back to Susa. There it stood for centuries, a symbol of Elamite power over its western rival. Moments like this remind us that the ancient world was deeply interconnected. Civilizations competed, borrowed ideas, and influenced one another constantly. But over time, the balance of power in the region began to shift. New forces were emerging. In Mesopotamia, empires rose and fell with increasing speed. The Assyrians became one of the most formidable military powers the world had yet seen. Their armies expanded aggressively across the Near East, and eventually their campaigns reached the lands of Elam. During the 7th century BCE, Assyrian kings launched devastating invasions against Elamite territory. Cities were attacked, temples destroyed, and populations displaced. One Assyrian ruler, Ashurbanipal, boasted in his inscriptions that he had reduced Elam to dust. The once great city of Susa was heavily damaged during these campaigns, its temples looted, its defenses broken. The long civilization of Elam began to fade from history. Yet, even as Elam declined, new peoples were arriving on the Iranian Plateau. These groups had migrated gradually from the vast steppe regions to the north. They brought with them horses, new languages, and new forms of social organization. Among these migrants were tribes that would later become known as the Medes and the Persians. At first, they lived as scattered clans across the mountains and valleys. But over time, their influence would grow, and from among them, new kingdoms would begin to form. One of those kingdoms, in the rugged lands of northwestern Iran, would eventually rise to challenge the greatest empire of its age. It would be known as the Kingdom of the Medes. And its emergence, it would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the story of Persia. As the civilization of Elam slowly faded, new peoples were already settling across the Iranian plateau. They arrived gradually, not in a single wave, but over many generations. These groups had traveled from the vast grasslands of Central Asia, from regions where the horizon stretches endlessly beneath wide skies, where herds of animals move across open plains, and where mobility is often more important than permanent settlement. The people who moved south into the Iranian plateau spoke languages belonging to what scholars now call the Indo-Iranian family. These languages were distant relatives of many spoken across Eurasia. Over time, their dialects would evolve into the early forms of Persian, but in these early centuries, they were simply tribes, small communities organized around clans and families. They traveled with herds of horses, cattle, and sheep. Horses were especially important. On the wide steppes of Central Asia, the horse had already transformed how people lived. It allowed travelers to move quickly across great distances. It allowed herders to guide large flocks, and eventually it would transform warfare as well. When these tribes settled across the Iranian plateau, they brought that knowledge with them. Archaeological evidence suggests that these new arrivals spread widely across the region. Some groups settled in the southern parts of the plateau. Others moved toward the rugged lands of the northwest. Among these tribes, two groups would eventually become especially important: the Medes and the Persians. At first, they were not powerful kingdoms. They were simply loose tribal societies, each tribe led by local chiefs, each valley home to different clans. The Medes settled primarily in the mountainous lands of northwestern Iran. Their territory lay between the Zagros Mountains and the Great Plains that stretched toward Mesopotamia. This region was both beautiful and strategic. The mountains offered natural protection, but they also controlled important routes that connected Mesopotamia with the Iranian Plateau. Caravans traveling east or west often passed through these mountain corridors. Anyone who controlled these routes held influence over trade. For many centuries, the Medes remained a collection of independent tribes. They farmed small fields in mountain valleys, raised animals on rocky slopes, and built fortified settlements on high ground. These fortifications were simple: stone walls surrounding clusters of homes, watchtowers placed where valleys narrowed, places where communities could retreat during times of danger. Because danger was never far away. To the west, beyond the mountains, one of the most formidable empires of the ancient world had begun to expand: the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians ruled from powerful cities such as Nineveh and Ashur. Their kings commanded disciplined armies equipped with iron weapons, siege machines, and organized military formations. Over the centuries, Assyrian armies marched repeatedly into the lands of the Medes. Their campaigns were recorded in long inscriptions carved into stone. In these records, Assyrian kings described raids into the mountains. They demanded tribute, grain, livestock, precious metals. Local tribes were often forced to acknowledge Assyrian authority, but controlling the mountains was never easy. The terrain was harsh, the valleys narrow, and the tribes were skilled at retreating into difficult landscapes. Even powerful empires struggled to maintain lasting control there. Slowly, the experience of resisting Assyrian pressure began to shape the Medes. Tribal leaders realized that isolated clans could not stand against organized imperial armies. But if tribes cooperated, they might defend their lands more effectively. Over time, a process of unification began. According to later Greek historians, one figure played an important role in this transformation: a leader named Deioces. The historical details remain uncertain, but ancient traditions describe Deioces as a man who brought order among the Median tribes. He encouraged them to resolve disputes through formal judgments, rather than through endless cycles of tribal conflict. Gradually, his reputation grew. People from different clans began to seek his decisions in legal matters, and through this role, his authority expanded. Eventually, the tribes chose him as their king. Whether this story is entirely accurate or partly legend, it reflects a broader reality. The Median tribes were beginning to organize themselves into a more unified kingdom. Their capital, according to tradition, was established at a city called Ecbatana. Today, this location corresponds roughly to the modern Iranian city of Hamadan. Ancient sources describe Ecbatana as a remarkable place, a city surrounded by 7 concentric walls, each wall painted in different colors. The innermost enclosure protected the royal palace and treasury. Whether these descriptions are entirely literal or somewhat symbolic, Ecbatana clearly became an important political center. From here, Median rulers gradually extended their influence over neighboring tribes, and the kingdom continued to grow. Another Median ruler, known as Cyaxares, is remembered as a particularly capable leader. During his reign, the Median army underwent important reforms. Rather than fighting only as loosely organized tribal warriors, the army was divided into specialized units: infantry, archers, and cavalry. This organization made the Median forces more effective in battle, and soon a remarkable opportunity appeared. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for centuries, began to weaken. Internal struggles and external pressures slowly eroded its power. Neighboring peoples sensed the change. Among them were the Babylonians, to the south, and the Medes, in the mountains to the east. In the year 612 BCE, these two forces formed an alliance. Median and Babylonian armies marched together toward the great Assyrian capital, Nineveh. At that time, Nineveh was one of the largest cities in the world. Its walls were enormous, its palaces filled with treasures gathered from conquered lands. But even great cities can fall. After a long siege, the Allied armies breached the defenses. Nineveh was destroyed, and with its fall, the Assyrian Empire collapsed. For the Medes, this victory transformed their position in the region. They were no longer simply mountain tribes. They had become a major power in the ancient Near East. Their influence stretched across large portions of the Iranian Plateau, and for a time, the Median kingdom stood among the dominant states of the region. Yet history rarely remains still. Even as the Medes reached the height of their power, another group of people was rising quietly in the southern lands of the plateau. They were related to the Medes. They shared similar languages and traditions, but their homeland lay farther south, in a region known as Parsa. The people of that land would one day become known to the world as the Persians, and from among them, a leader would soon emerge who would change the history of the entire ancient world. His name? It was Cyrus. Yet the story of Persia is not only a story of kings and empires, it is also a story of ideas. Long before the rise of Cyrus, long before the Persian Empire spread across continents, a powerful spiritual tradition was already taking shape among the people of the Iranian plateau. This tradition would become known as Zoroastrianism. Its origins are connected to a mysterious figure, a teacher and prophet called Zarathustra. The exact dates of Zarathustra's life remain uncertain. Some scholars believe he lived more than 3,000 years ago. Others place him somewhat later. But wherever the precise date may fall, his ideas would become some of the most influential religious concepts of the ancient world. Zarathustra is believed to have been born somewhere in the eastern regions of the Iranian world, perhaps in lands that today belong to northeastern Iran, or parts of Central Asia. In those distant centuries, religious traditions among Indo-Iranian tribes centered on many gods. Natural forces were often understood as divine powers: storms, fire, wind, the sky itself. Rituals were performed to honor these forces. Priests conducted ceremonies involving sacred chants and offerings. But Zarathustra introduced something different. According to ancient texts, he experienced a profound spiritual vision. In this vision, he encountered a divine being known as Ahura Mazda. The name means wise lord. Ahura Mazda represented truth, light, and wisdom. Zarathustra taught that this divine presence stood at the center of the universe. But the world was not governed by harmony alone. Instead, it was shaped by a great moral struggle, a struggle between truth and falsehood, between light and darkness, between creation and destruction. Opposing Ahura Mazda was a destructive spirit known as Angra Mainyu, a force associated with chaos, deception, and suffering. Human beings, Zarathustra taught, stood in the middle of this cosmic struggle. Every choice mattered. Every action contributed either to the forces of truth or to the forces of chaos. This idea was powerful because it placed moral responsibility directly upon individuals. People were not simply subjects of distant gods. They were participants in the shaping of the world. Zoroastrian teachings often summarize this idea in a simple phrase: good thoughts, good words, good deeds. These three principles formed the foundation of ethical life. According to the tradition, those who lived with honesty and compassion strengthened the forces of truth. Those who chose cruelty or deception strengthened the forces of destruction. In this way, every human life became part of a larger cosmic story. Fire held a special place in this tradition, not as an object of worship itself, but as a symbol. Fire represented purity, light, and the presence of truth. In Zoroastrian temples, a sacred flame was carefully maintained. Priests tended these fires with great care. The flames burned continuously, sometimes for generations. Visitors entering these temples often found quiet halls where the sacred fire glowed softly in the center, its light reflecting on polished stone walls. The atmosphere was calm, almost meditative. And in many ways, this quiet symbolism of light and truth reflected the deeper philosophy of the religion itself. Zoroastrian texts were eventually recorded in a collection known as the Avesta. These writings included hymns believed to have been composed by Zarathustra himself. They describe a universe governed by moral choice, a world where justice and truth ultimately triumph over darkness. Another remarkable idea within Zoroastrian belief was the concept of a final renewal of the world. According to this tradition, history would one day reach a moment of transformation. The forces of truth would defeat the forces of destruction. The world would be purified, and humanity would live in harmony with creation. Concepts like these would later echo in other religious traditions across the Near East. Ideas about judgment, heaven, hell, and the ultimate victory of good over evil. Some historians believe that these themes influenced later developments in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Although the details differ between traditions, the echoes of Zoroastrian thought can still be recognized. For the ancient peoples of the Iranian Plateau, these teachings offered something profound. They provided a sense of order in a world often shaped by uncertainty. Empires rose and fell. Wars reshaped borders. But beneath these changes, the struggle between truth and deception remained constant, and individuals still had the power to choose their path. As centuries passed, Zoroastrian beliefs spread among many Iranian tribes. Priests preserved sacred chants. Fire temples appeared in settlements across the plateau, and gradually, this spiritual tradition became closely connected with the identity of Iranian peoples. In the centuries ahead, when the Persian Empire eventually rose under the leadership of Cyrus and his successors, Zoroastrian ideas would help shape the moral language of imperial rule. Kings presented themselves not only as rulers of land and armies, but as defenders of truth and order in the world. But that moment still lay in the future. For now, the Iranian plateau remained a land of tribes, villages, and emerging kingdoms. The Medes had already begun to unite the mountain tribes of the north, and in the southern lands of Parsa, another group of Iranian people was quietly growing in strength. They were close relatives of the Medes. Their language and customs were similar, but their destiny would soon surpass them all. Among these southern tribes, a royal family would rise, and from that family, a young leader would emerge. His ambition, his vision, and his extraordinary ability to unite different peoples would soon reshape the ancient world. His name was Cyrus, and with him, the Persian Empire would begin. His name was Cyrus. In the long history of Persia, few figures would become as legendary as this young ruler from the southern lands of the Iranian plateau. Cyrus was born into the royal family of a small kingdom known as Anshan. This kingdom lay within the region called Parsa, the homeland of the people who would later be known as the Persians. At the time of Cyrus's birth, the Persians were not yet masters of a vast empire. They were subjects of another power, the Median kingdom, the Medes, who had once united the mountain tribes of northwestern Iran, had gradually extended their authority over neighboring regions. Among the lands under their influence was Parsa. So the early life of Cyrus unfolded within a political world where Persia existed under Median rule. Ancient stories about Cyrus's childhood are filled with dramatic legends. One legend tells a dramatic story. The Median king Astyages once dreamed that his grandson would overthrow him. Frightened by the prophecy, he ordered the infant Cyrus to be killed, but the soldiers sent to carry out the order could not do it. Instead, the child was secretly raised by a shepherd family in the mountains. Whether this story is true or not, it reveals something important. Even in ancient times, people believed Cyrus was destined for greatness. Greek historians writing centuries later recorded tales of prophecies, dreams, and attempts by a Median king to prevent the young prince from one day taking power. Some of these stories may be myths. Others may contain fragments of historical truth. But what is certain is that Cyrus eventually became ruler of the Persian people. And when he did, he possessed an unusual ability. He understood how to unite different tribes. Rather than ruling through fear alone, he built loyalty through cooperation. Among the Persians, this leadership quickly strengthened his position. But the most important moment of Cyrus's early reign came around the year 550 BCE. At that time, the Median king Astyages still ruled the larger empire. Yet tensions had begun to grow. Some Median nobles were dissatisfied with their king. Others admired the rising Persian leader. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, a revolt began. Cyrus and his supporters challenged the authority of Astyages. The conflict that followed was not simply a battle between Persians and Medes. In many ways, it was a transfer of power between closely related peoples. When the fighting ended, Cyrus emerged victorious. The Median king was defeated, but instead of destroying the Median kingdom, Cyrus made a remarkable decision. He chose to unite the two peoples. Median nobles were allowed to keep their positions. Median soldiers joined the Persian armies, and the traditions of both cultures became part of the new state. This act of political wisdom helped transform a regional rebellion into something much larger. For the first time, the Persians stood at the center of a powerful and expanding kingdom. Yet Cyrus's ambitions did not stop there. Beyond the Iranian plateau lay other wealthy lands. To the west, across the mountains and plains of Anatolia, stood the kingdom of Lydia. Lydia was famous for its riches. Its rivers carried gold dust from nearby mountains. Its cities were prosperous centers of trade, and its king, Croesus, was known throughout the ancient world for his immense wealth. But Croesus also watched the rise of Cyrus with growing concern. The sudden appearance of a powerful Persian ruler threatened the balance of power across the region. So Croesus prepared for war. The armies of Lydia marched eastward toward Persian territory, but Cyrus responded quickly. His forces moved west across the plateau and into Anatolia. The two armies eventually met near the city of Sardis. Ancient sources describe an unusual moment during this campaign. Lydia's cavalry was famous across the region. Their horses were fast and well trained, but Cyrus is said to have deployed camels at the front of his army. The unfamiliar smell of the camels unsettled the Lydian horses. Their formations broke, and the Persian forces gained the advantage. Whether the story is fully accurate or partly symbolic, the outcome is clear. Cyrus defeated the Lydian kingdom. Sardis fell, and with it, the vast wealth of Lydia came under Persian control. This victory dramatically expanded the reach of Cyrus's kingdom. But an even greater prize lay farther south. Along the great rivers of Mesopotamia stood one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world, Babylon. For centuries, Babylon had been a center of learning, trade, and imperial power. Its walls were enormous. Some ancient writers claimed chariots could race along the top of them. Inside the city stood temples, palaces, and one of the most advanced urban societies of the ancient world. To conquer Babylon would require more than military strength. It would require careful strategy. But Cyrus had already shown that his ambitions were vast, and soon his attention turned toward the legendary city beside the Euphrates. The stage was set for one of the most famous moments in the history of the ancient Near East. Because when Cyrus approached Babylon, something extraordinary would happen. The great city would fall, almost without a fight. South of the Iranian Plateau, beyond the mountains and desert roads, the land slowly opens into wide river plains. Here, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow through fertile soil. For thousands of years, these waters supported some of the earliest cities in human history, and among those cities, one stood above all the others: Babylon. In the ancient world, Babylon was legendary. At sunset, the city glowed with torchlight. Priests climbed the temple towers to observe the stars. Merchants closed their stalls along the processional way, and travelers entering the Ishtar Gate passed beneath towering blue walls covered in images of lions and dragons. Travelers spoke of its enormous walls, its temples towering above the city skyline, and its bustling streets filled with merchants from distant lands. For centuries, Babylon had been a center of culture and learning. Astronomers studied the movements of the stars from temple towers. Priests recorded religious texts on clay tablets. Merchants traded goods that arrived from every corner of the Near East. The city itself was surrounded by powerful defenses. High walls made of brick stretched across the plain. Massive gates marked the entrances to the city. Among them, the most famous was the Ishtar Gate, decorated with deep blue glazed bricks and images of lions and dragons. Beyond these gates, wide processional roads led toward the temples of the gods. Babylon appeared almost impossible to conquer. Yet, by the middle of the 6th century BCE, the political situation inside the city had become uncertain. The Babylonian throne was held by a king named Nabonidus. Unlike many earlier rulers, Nabonidus spent long periods away from the capital. He devoted much of his attention to religious reforms that were not always popular among Babylon's powerful priesthood. As dissatisfaction slowly grew inside the city, news arrived of a powerful ruler approaching from the east. Cyrus, the Persian king, had already defeated Lydia. His authority now stretched across much of the Near East, and his armies were moving toward Mesopotamia. In the year 539 BCE, Persian forces advanced into Babylonian territory. Several smaller battles took place along the rivers and canals of the region. Babylonian defenses began to weaken. Eventually, Cyrus's army approached the great city itself. Ancient sources describe what happened next in different ways, but many accounts agree on one remarkable detail. Babylon did not fall after a long and destructive siege. Instead, the city was taken with surprisingly little resistance. Some traditions suggest that Persian forces diverted part of the Euphrates River, lowering the water level enough for soldiers to enter the city through river channels. Other accounts emphasize political factors within Babylon itself. Certain groups inside the city may have welcomed Cyrus as a new ruler. Whatever the exact sequence of events, Babylon soon came under Persian control, and Cyrus entered the city as its new king. But what happened next would become even more important than the conquest itself. Many ancient rulers celebrated victory through destruction. Cities were burned, populations enslaved, temples looted. But Cyrus chose a different path. Instead of destroying Babylon, he presented himself as its legitimate protector. Local traditions were respected, temples were restored, and priests were allowed to continue their religious practices. One artifact from this period has become especially famous. It is known today as the Cyrus cylinder. The object itself is a small clay cylinder covered with lines of cuneiform writing. In this text, Cyrus describes his entry into Babylon. He presents himself as a ruler, chosen to restore order and justice. The inscription states that he allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands, and that he helped restore their religious sanctuaries. Among those affected by this policy were the Jewish communities who had previously been exiled to Babylon. Under Cyrus's rule, many of them were permitted to return to Jerusalem. There they began rebuilding their temple. Because of this act, Cyrus appears in later Jewish writings as a figure of great respect. Some texts even describe him as a chosen instrument for restoring the people of Israel. The policies described in the Cyrus cylinder have often been interpreted as an early example of religious tolerance. While ancient empires still exercised power through authority and taxation, Cyrus understood that respecting local traditions could help maintain stability across vast territories. This approach would later become one of the defining features of Persian imperial rule. Rather than forcing every region to adopt a single culture, the Persian system allowed many different peoples to maintain their identities. Languages continued to be spoken, local customs remained in place, and religious traditions were often protected. The Persian king ruled over them all, but he did not attempt to erase their differences. For the people of Babylon, life continued. Markets reopened, temples remained active, and administration of the city was gradually integrated into the growing Persian state. But the conquest of Babylon also marked something larger. For the first time in history, a single empire now controlled lands stretching from the Iranian Plateau to the Mediterranean world. The empire of Cyrus had become enormous, yet even greater expansion still lay ahead, because beyond Babylon, new territories waited. Egypt to the south, Central Asia to the northeast, and the vast lands of Anatolia to the west. Cyrus had built the foundations of something unprecedented, a multi-continental empire. But the work of shaping and organizing that empire would soon pass to those who followed him. And among them, new rulers would transform Persia into one of the most sophisticated states of the ancient world. The next chapter of this story would begin with the expansion of Persian power beyond Mesopotamia, and with the rise of a king who would attempt to rule lands even farther from the Iranian plateau. His name was Cambyses. He was the son of Cyrus, and when the great founder of the Persian Empire died, the responsibility of ruling that vast territory passed to him. The empire he inherited was already enormous, from the mountains of Iran to the great cities of Mesopotamia, from the plains of Anatolia to the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. But in the ancient world, power rarely remained still. Every ruler faced the same question. Would the empire remain secure, or would its enemies begin to challenge it? For Cambyses, the answer soon appeared to the south. Beyond the deserts of Sinai lay another ancient civilization, Egypt. Even in the 6th century BCE, Egypt was already one of the oldest states on earth. For thousands of years, pharaohs had ruled along the Nile. Their monuments still rose above the desert sands. Pyramids, temples, colossal statues carved from stone. The Nile River itself shaped Egyptian life. Each year, its waters flooded the surrounding land, leaving behind rich soil for farming. Villages stretched along its banks. Fields of grain moved in the warm desert wind, and boats traveled slowly along the river, connecting cities that had existed since the dawn of history. To the Persian court, Egypt represented both wealth and prestige. If Persia could control Egypt, it would command nearly the entire eastern Mediterranean world. So, Cambyses prepared his campaign. Moving an army across the Sinai Desert was not simple. The region between the Levant and Egypt was dry and difficult. Water sources were scarce, and large forces required careful planning. Ancient writers suggest that Cambyses secured assistance from Arab tribes who knew the desert routes well. Supplies of water were carried across the sands, and slowly the Persian army advanced toward the Nile. The Egyptian king at that time was Psamtik III. His forces gathered to resist the Persian advance. The decisive confrontation occurred near a place called Pelusium, a city that guarded the eastern entrance to the Nile Delta. Ancient historians later recorded curious stories about the battle. One tale claims that Persian soldiers placed sacred Egyptian animals in front of their lines, believing Egyptian warriors would hesitate to attack them. Whether this story is entirely true or partly legend, the outcome of the battle is clear. Cambyses defeated the Egyptian army, Pelusium fell, and the road to Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, lay open. Soon afterward, Egypt itself came under Persian control. Cambyses entered the country not only as a conqueror, but as its new ruler. He adopted the traditional title of pharaoh. This was a common strategy among Persian kings. Rather than replacing local traditions entirely, they often adopted them, allowing conquered regions to maintain familiar systems of governance. In Egypt, and this meant that temples continued to function. Priests continued their rituals, and many aspects of Egyptian culture remained unchanged. Yet despite these efforts, Cambyses soon gained a reputation among some ancient writers as a harsh and unpredictable ruler. Stories circulated describing strange actions and erratic decisions. Some accounts claimed he mocked Egyptian religious practices. Others described acts of cruelty or instability. Modern historians approach these stories with caution. Many of the surviving narratives were written by Greek authors, who often viewed Persia with suspicion. So it is difficult to know how much of this portrayal reflects historical reality. What seems certain is that Cambyses attempted to extend Persian power even further. He considered campaigns deeper into Africa, and possibly toward the oasis regions of the western desert. One famous story tells of a mysterious expedition. According to the historian Herodotus, Cambyses once sent an army of 50,000 men into the desert. Their destination was the distant Siwa oasis. But somewhere along the journey, the army vanished. Herodotus claimed that a massive sandstorm buried the soldiers beneath the dunes. For centuries, this story captured the imagination of historians and explorers alike. Even in modern times, some expeditions have searched the Egyptian desert for traces of this lost army, but so far, its fate remains one of the many mysteries of ancient history. While these events unfolded in Egypt, another crisis was developing far away in the Persian heartland. News arrived that a man claiming to be Cambyses' brother had seized the throne. His name was said to be Bardia. The situation was confusing. Some believed the man truly was the king's brother. Others suspected he was an impostor. Cambyses began his journey back toward Persia to confront the rebellion. But during that journey, something unexpected happened. Cambyses died. Ancient sources describe the death as accidental, a wound from his own sword. Others suggest darker possibilities. Whatever the truth may be, the empire now faced a dangerous moment. Its ruler was gone. A mysterious figure sat on the throne, and powerful nobles across the empire were uncertain about who truly held authority. The stability created by Cyrus now seemed fragile. Yet within this uncertainty, another figure was preparing to act. A nobleman from the Persian elite, a man who would soon claim the throne for himself, and who would reshape the Persian Empire more profoundly than any ruler since Cyrus. His name was Darius. And when the Persian Empire faced one of the most uncertain moments in its young history, he emerged as the man who would restore order. Darius did not begin his life as a king. He was a member of the Persian nobility, part of the extended royal family that served within the ruling structure created by Cyrus. When news spread that a mysterious figure named Bardia had taken the throne, many nobles began to question the situation. According to the official account, later recorded by Darius himself, the man on the throne was not truly the brother of Cambyses. Instead, he claimed the figure was an impostor, a man named Gaumata. Whether this claim was entirely accurate or partly political justification remains debated by historians. But what followed changed the course of Persian history. Darius joined with a group of noble allies. Together, they organized a coup against the new ruler. In the year 522 BCE, the palace was seized. The man claiming to be Bardia was killed, and Darius proclaimed himself king of the Persian Empire. Yet, gaining the throne was only the beginning. The empire created by Cyrus stretched across vast lands, from Anatolia to Central Asia, from Mesopotamia to Egypt. And when news of the change in leadership spread, rebellions began to appear across many provinces. Local rulers attempted to reclaim independence. Cities refused to recognize the new king. For Darius, the first years of his reign were filled with challenges, but he moved quickly. Campaign after campaign was launched to restore control. Ancient inscriptions describe these events in dramatic detail. One of the most famous records still survives today, carved high into a cliff face along an ancient road in western Iran. This monument is known as the Behistun inscription. On the stone relief, Darius is shown standing above defeated rebels. The carving tells the story of how he suppressed uprisings across the empire. According to the inscription, he defeated numerous challengers within a short period of time. By the end of these campaigns, his authority had been firmly established. But Darius understood something important. Conquering lands was not enough. If such a vast empire was to survive, it needed organization, it needed systems, it needed administration capable of managing distant territories. So, Darius began one of the most ambitious political reforms of the ancient world. He divided the empire into provinces known as satrapies. Each satrapy was governed by an official called a satrap. These satraps were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and overseeing local administration. But Darius also knew that power could easily become dangerous in distant provinces, so the satraps were carefully monitored. Military commanders and royal inspectors reported directly to the king. Greek writers later described these inspectors as the eyes and ears of the king. Their role was simple: travel throughout the empire, observe local conditions, and ensure loyalty to the crown. In this way, the authority remained connected to the royal court. Yet communication across such distances required something more. The empire stretched thousands of miles. Messages carried by ordinary travelers could take months to arrive. So Darius created another remarkable innovation: a network of imperial roads. The most famous of these routes became known as the Royal Road. It ran from the city of Sardis in western Anatolia all the way to Susa, one of the royal capitals of Persia. Along this road, stations were built at regular intervals. Messengers could stop, rest their horses, and continue their journey. Through this system, royal communications moved far faster than before. Ancient historians marveled at its efficiency. One Greek writer later described the system with admiration. He noted that neither snow, nor rain, nor darkness of night prevented the king's couriers from completing their journeys. The royal road allowed information to travel across the empire with surprising speed. And information, for an empire of this scale, was power. Darius also introduced standardized systems of taxation. Each satrapy contributed resources according to its capacity: gold, silver, grain, livestock. These revenues supported the imperial administration. They also funded construction projects across the empire. One of Darius's most ambitious building programs took place on the Iranian Plateau itself. There, near the earlier ceremonial center established by Cyrus, a new city began to rise: Persepolis. Unlike older cities that had grown slowly over centuries, Persepolis was carefully planned. Terraces were carved into the hillside. Massive stone staircases were built. Columns rose high above palace halls. The city functioned primarily as a ceremonial capital. Delegations from across the empire traveled there during great festivals. Representatives from distant provinces arrived carrying tribute. Carved reliefs still visible today show these delegations in remarkable detail. Men from Egypt, Babylon, Lydia, Central Asia, each group wearing distinctive clothing, each bringing gifts from their homeland. These scenes captured something extraordinary: an empire made up of many cultures, many languages, many traditions, yet all connected under a single imperial structure. Under Darius, the Persian Empire became more than a conquered territory. It became a functioning system, a network of roads, administrators, cities, and cultural exchange. But even as Darius strengthened the empire internally, events beyond its western borders would soon draw Persia into a new conflict. Across the Aegean Sea, small Greek city-states watched the growth of Persian power with increasing concern. At first, these Greek cities were distant, fragmented, often competing with one another. Yet, in time, their resistance would bring Persia into one of the most famous rivalries of the ancient world, a rivalry between East and West. And the first sparks of that conflict would soon appear along the western edge of the Persian Empire. Across the western frontier of the Persian Empire, the coastline of Anatolia faces a different world. Beyond the blue waters of the Aegean Sea lie the lands of Greece. Unlike the vast Persian Empire, Greece was not a single unified state. It was a landscape of mountains, islands, and small valleys separated from one another. Within these valleys stood independent city-states: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and many others. Each city had its own government, its own traditions, and often its own rivalries. These cities competed for influence across the Aegean world, sometimes through trade, sometimes through alliances, and sometimes through war. For centuries, the Greek cities along the western coast of Anatolia had lived under the influence of larger empires, first Lydia, and later Persia. These cities were known collectively as the Ionian cities, places such as Miletus and Ephesus. They were culturally Greek, but politically part of the Persian imperial system. At first, Persian rule in these cities was relatively stable. Local leaders governed the population. Tribute was paid to the empire. Trade continued across the sea. But toward the end of the 6th century BCE, tensions began to grow. Some Ionian leaders sought greater independence, and in the year 499 BCE, a rebellion began. This event is known as the Ionian Revolt. Cities across the region rose against Persian authority. The rebels achieved several successes. They received limited support from mainland Greece. In particular, Athens sent ships and soldiers to assist them. Together, the rebel forces even managed to attack the city of Sardis, one of the major Persian administrative centers in Anatolia. Parts of the city were burned during the assault. For the Persian court, this was a serious insult. Darius had spent years stabilizing and organizing the empire. Now, a rebellion supported by distant Greek cities had disrupted the western provinces. the Persian response would not come immediately, but it would come. Over the next several years, Persian forces gradually suppressed the revolt. City after city was brought back under imperial control. By 494 BCE, the Ionian revolt had effectively ended. But Darius had not forgotten the involvement of Athens. He reportedly asked a servant to remind him daily of the city's name, so that the memory of its actions would never fade. Eventually, he decided to act. The Persian king ordered an expedition across the Aegean Sea. Its goal was clear: punish Athens and restore Persian authority along the Greek frontier. In 490 BCE, a Persian fleet crossed the Aegean, landing on the plains near a small town called Marathon. The Athenians responded quickly. Citizen soldiers gathered to defend their land. These soldiers were not professional warriors. They were farmers, craftsmen, and ordinary citizens trained for military service. Yet they formed disciplined infantry units known as hoplites, heavily armed soldiers carrying shields and spears. When the two armies met on the plain of Marathon, the battle that followed surprised many observers. The Athenian forces advanced rapidly across the field, breaking the Persian lines. The Persian army eventually withdrew to its ships. For the Greeks, the victory became legendary. It proved that the seemingly unstoppable Persian Empire could be resisted. But from the perspective of Persia, the defeat at Marathon was only a minor setback. The empire remained vast, its resources immense, and preparations for another campaign would soon begin. Darius died before he could launch a second invasion. The responsibility for continuing the effort passed to his son, Xerxes. When Xerxes became king, he inherited not only the empire, but also the unfinished conflict with Greece. Over several years, he prepared a new campaign, one far larger than the earlier expedition. Engineers constructed bridges of ships across the narrow strait known as the Hellespont, allowing Persian forces to cross from Asia into Europe. Supplies were gathered from across the empire. Armies assembled from many different regions. When the invasion finally began, it was one of the largest military movements the ancient world had ever seen. The Persian forces advanced slowly through northern Greece. Some cities submitted without resistance. Others prepared to fight. One of the most famous encounters occurred at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae. Here, a small Greek force attempted to block the Persian advance. Among them were warriors from the city of Sparta, led by their king, Leonidas. For several days, the defenders held the narrow pass, but eventually, Persian forces discovered a path around their position. The Greek defenders were surrounded, and the pass was taken. The Persian army continued south. Athens itself was evacuated, its population fleeing to nearby islands. Soon afterward, the city was occupied and burned. Yet, the conflict was not finished. Greek leaders had already planned a different strategy. Rather than meeting the Persian army again on open land, they prepared to fight at sea. The decisive moment came near the island of Salamis. There, Greek fleets maneuvered within narrow waters that limited the movement of the larger Persian navy. The battle that followed turned the course of the war. Greek ships successfully disrupted Persian formations. Many Persian vessels were damaged or destroyed. After the defeat at Salamis, Xerxes chose to withdraw much of his army. The following year, remaining Persian forces in Greece were defeated in another battle on land. The Great Invasion had come to an end. For the Greek city-states, these events became part of their collective memory. Stories of courage and resistance passed into legend. But from the broader perspective of history, the Persian Empire remained powerful. Its territories still stretched across continents, and its influence over the ancient world continued. Yet the rivalry between Persia and the Greek world would echo for generations. Because beyond the mountains of northern Greece, another kingdom was slowly growing in strength, a kingdom that would one day unite the Greek city-states, and from that kingdom a young ruler would emerge, a ruler whose ambitions would lead him eastward, toward Persia. His name was Alexander. Across the mountains and valleys of northern Greece, a new power was beginning to grow. For generations, the Greek world had been divided into many independent city-states: Athens, Sparta, Thebes, each proud of its own traditions, each wary of the others. But during the 4th century BCE, a kingdom to the north began to unite these divided lands. This kingdom was Macedon. Its rulers had spent years strengthening their armies and expanding their influence across Greece. One of these rulers, King Philip II, transformed Macedon into a formidable military power. Philip reorganized his army. He introduced new tactics. Long spears known as sarissas allowed Macedonian soldiers to fight in deep formations. These formations, called phalanxes, could advance slowly but with tremendous force. Under Philip's leadership, Macedon defeated several Greek rivals. Gradually, many of the Greek city-states were brought into alliance under Macedonian leadership. But Philip's ambitions did not stop in Greece. Beyond the Aegean Sea, the vast Persian Empire still dominated much of the known world. For many Greeks, Persia remained both a rival and a symbol. Memories of earlier wars still lingered, and Philip began to speak openly about a new campaign, an invasion of Persia itself. Yet history sometimes changes course unexpectedly. Before Philip could begin this campaign, he was assassinated. His son inherited the throne. That son was Alexander. Alexander was only 20 years old when he became king. Yet, from an early age, he had received a remarkable education. Among his teachers was the philosopher Aristotle. From him, Alexander learned about philosophy, science, and literature. But Alexander was not only a student of ideas, he was also trained in warfare. From childhood, he had observed his father's campaigns. He had ridden with armies, and he had learned how to command soldiers in the field. When Alexander became king, some Greek cities believed the young ruler might be weak. Several attempted to rebel, but Alexander acted quickly. Marching across Greece, he reasserted Macedonian authority. The rebellions ended, and soon. Alexander turned his attention toward the ambition his father had once declared: the Persian Empire. In the year 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the narrow waters of the Hellespont. This strait separated Europe from Asia. To Alexander, the crossing held symbolic meaning. He was entering the lands of the Persian Empire, the empire founded by Cyrus, strengthened by Darius, and still ruling vast territories. The first major battle occurred near a river called the Granicus. Persian forces attempted to stop the Macedonian advance, but Alexander's army succeeded in forcing a crossing. The Persian defenses collapsed. With this victory, the Macedonian campaign gained momentum. City after city across Anatolia opened its gates. Some surrendered peacefully. Others were taken by force. Yet Alexander often presented himself not simply as a conqueror, but as a liberator of Greek cities previously under Persian authority. As the campaign continued, Alexander pushed deeper into the Persian territories. The Persian king at that time was Content reference Oisit, Index 1. Unlike earlier rulers of the empire, Darius III had come to power during a time of political instability. When news of Alexander's invasion arrived, he gathered an army to confront the Macedonian advance. The two forces eventually met near a place called Issus. The battlefield lay between mountains and sea. narrow terrain limited the movement of large forces. During the battle, Alexander led a direct charge toward the center of the Persian line. The fighting was intense, but eventually the Persian army broke formation. Darius III fled the battlefield, leaving behind much of his camp and treasure. The Macedonian army continued its march. Cities across the eastern Mediterranean coast fell under Alexander's control. Tyre, Gaza, and eventually Egypt. In Egypt, Alexander was welcomed by many as a new ruler. He visited ancient temples, and according to later traditions, Egyptian priests recognized him as Pharaoh. A new city was founded on the Mediterranean coast. It would become known as Alexandria, a place that would later grow into one of the most famous centers of learning in the ancient world. But Alexander's greatest confrontation with Persia still lay ahead. In 331 BCE, the two armies met again. This time, on a wide plain near the village of Gaugamela. The battlefield stretched across open land, allowing the Persian army to deploy its full strength. Chariots, cavalry, large formations of infantry. For Darius III, this was a final opportunity to stop the Macedonian advance. Yet, once again, Alexander's strategy proved decisive. The Macedonian phalanx held the center, while Alexander himself led a cavalry charge toward a vulnerable point in the Persian line. The formation broke. Confusion spread through the army, and once more, Darius fled the field. After Gaugamela, the road to the heart of the Persian Empire lay open. One by one, the great cities of the empire fell into Alexander's hands. Babylon, Susa, and finally, the ceremonial capital of Persepolis. When Alexander entered Persepolis, he encountered the immense palaces built by generations of Persian kings, columns rising high above stone terraces, reliefs carved with images of delegations from across the empire, treasuries filled with wealth accumulated over centuries. For a moment, it seemed that the Persian imperial tradition might simply continue under new leadership. But something unexpected happened. One night, a fire began in the palace complex. Ancient sources offer different explanations. Some claim it was an accident. Others say it was a deliberate act, a symbolic gesture of revenge for earlier Persian attacks on Greece. Whatever the cause, the flames spread through parts of the palace, and the great halls of Persepolis were damaged by fire. With this event, the long rule of the Achaemenid dynasty effectively came to an end. Yet, even as the empire collapsed, Alexander did not destroy everything that came before him. Instead, he adopted many elements of Persian royal tradition. He wore Persian clothing, he employed Persian administrators, and he attempted to govern the vast territories he had conquered as the new king of Asia. But Alexander's empire, like many empires built through rapid conquest, would face its own challenges, because the young king who had defeated Persia would not live long enough to stabilize the world he had created. For a moment, it seemed as if the Persian world had disappeared forever. But history rarely ends so quickly. The empire created by Alexander had grown with astonishing speed. In little more than a decade, his armies had crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers, from Greece to Egypt, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from Mesopotamia deep into Central Asia. Cities surrendered, kings were defeated, and one of the greatest empires of the ancient world collapsed before him. Yet such rapid expansion carried its own risks. Alexander's empire depended almost entirely on his personal leadership, his ability to command loyalty from soldiers and generals, his presence at the center of every major decision. And when that presence disappeared, the balance of power began to shift. In the year 323 BCE, Alexander died in the city of Babylon. He was only 32 years old. Ancient sources describe his final days in different ways. Some speak of illness. Others suggest exhaustion after years of campaigning. There are even stories of poisoning. But the true cause remains uncertain. What is clear is that Alexander left no clear successor. He had a young son, not yet able to rule, and many powerful generals who had fought beside him across the years of conquest. These generals soon became rivals. Historians often refer to them as the Diadochi, the successors. Each commanded armies, each governed parts of the empire, and each hoped to secure authority for himself. At first, they attempted to preserve the appearance of unity. Alexander's infant son and half-brother were declared joint kings, but real power rested with the generals. Soon, conflicts erupted. Armies moved across the former territories of the empire. The battles were fought in Anatolia, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia. The unity Alexander had created began to fracture. Over several decades, the empire gradually divided into separate kingdoms. One general secured control of Egypt, another ruled parts of Greece, and the lands that once formed the Persian heartland eventually came under the authority of Seleucus. Seleucus had served as one of Alexander's commanders. After years of struggle, he established a kingdom that stretched across much of the old Eastern Empire. This realm became known as the Seleucid Empire. Its territories included Mesopotamia, Syria, and large portions of the Iranian Plateau. From a distance, the Seleucid state resembled the empire that had existed before. Large territories, major cities, networks of trade routes. But culturally, important changes began to appear. Alexander's conquest had spread Greek culture far beyond the traditional boundaries of Greece. Language, art, architecture, philosophy, these influences spread across the Eastern Mediterranean and into Asia. This cultural blending became known as the Hellenistic world. Cities founded during this era often reflected Greek urban design. Wide streets arranged in organized grids, public spaces for markets and gatherings, temples dedicated to Greek gods. Greek language became widely used in administration and commerce. Merchants and scholars from different regions communicated through it. Greek theaters appeared in some cities, and sculptures began to reflect the artistic traditions of the Mediterranean world. Yet, despite these changes, the deeper traditions of the Iranian plateau did not disappear. In villages across the mountains and valleys, local customs continued. Ancient languages remained in daily use. Religious traditions, including Zoroastrian practices, survived among many communities. The Seleucid kings ruled from cities influenced by Greek culture, but much of the countryside remained deeply connected to older Iranian ways of life. Over time, this created a complex society. Greek settlers lived alongside Iranian populations. Merchants traveled between cultures. Ideas blended and evolved. Trade flourished across the region. Caravans moved along routes that connected the Mediterranean world with Central Asia. Goods such as textiles, metals, and spices traveled enormous distances. These networks helped sustain the economy of the Seleucid Empire. Yet governing such vast territories was never easy. The empire stretched across regions with different languages, different climates, and different political traditions. Rebellions occasionally broke out in distant provinces, and maintaining control required constant effort. Gradually, some areas began to slip away from Seleucid authority. In the eastern territories, new powers were emerging. Among them were groups of Iranian peoples who had lived for generations along the northeastern frontiers. These communities had maintained strong traditions of horsemanship. Their societies valued mobility, and their warriors were skilled riders and archers. In time, one of these groups would rise to challenge the Seleucid rulers. Their homeland lay in a region known as Parthia, and the people who lived there would soon build a new empire. An empire that would restore Iranian leadership across much of the plateau. The age of Greek influence would not disappear entirely, but it would gradually give way to something different, a revival of Iranian power, and the first steps toward that revival were already beginning in the distant eastern lands, where a leader named Arsaces was preparing to challenge the authority of the Seleucid kings. Far to the northeast of the Seleucid Empire, beyond the great cities of Mesopotamia, the land changes once again. The terrain becomes harsher. Wide plains stretch beneath open skies. Deserts appear between scattered mountain ranges, and along the edges of these landscapes, small communities survive through mobility. These were lands where horses mattered more than cities, where people traveled long distances with their herds, and where independence remained deeply valued. This region was known in ancient times as Parthia. For generations, the Seleucid kings had attempted to govern these distant territories, but their authority was often limited. The empire was vast, and maintaining direct control over every frontier proved difficult. Local leaders retained considerable autonomy. Among these local groups, a tribe known as the Parni began to rise. They were skilled riders, accustomed to the harsh conditions of the steppe, and capable of moving quickly across large distances. Their leader was a man named Arsaces. In the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Arsaces led his followers into the region of Parthia. At the time, Seleucid authority there had weakened. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Arsaces seized control of the territory. What began as a small rebellion soon grew into something larger. The new rulers of Parthia gradually consolidated their power. Over time, the dynasty founded by Arsaces became known as the Arsacid dynasty. Their kingdom expanded slowly at first. The Parthians were not attempting to rebuild a massive empire overnight. Instead, they strengthened their position step by step. Local alliances were formed. Territories were secured, and gradually their influence spread across the northeastern Iranian plateau. Unlike the centralized structure of earlier Persian empires, Parthian rule developed into a more flexible system. Power was shared among several noble families. Regional leaders maintained significant authority over their lands. The king stood at the center of the political structure, but cooperation among powerful clans was essential. This arrangement sometimes produced internal rivalries, yet it also allowed the Parthian state to adapt to changing conditions. And one advantage stood above all others: their military strength. Parthian warfare was shaped by the landscape they inhabited. Open plains favored mobility, and Parthian warriors were masters of mounted combat. Two types of cavalry became especially important. The first were lightly armored horse archers. These riders carried powerful composite bows. From horseback, they could fire arrows with remarkable accuracy. Their horses moved swiftly across the battlefield, allowing them to strike and withdraw before enemies could respond. The second type of cavalry was the cataphract, heavily armored riders protected by metal or scale armor. Their horses were also partially armored. Together, rider and horse formed a formidable charging force. These warriors carried long lances, and when they advanced together, their impact could break enemy lines. But the most famous Parthian tactic involved a clever maneuver. Horse archers would appear to retreat from the battlefield, turning their horses as though fleeing. Yet even while riding away, they could twist their bodies and fire arrows backward at pursuing enemies. This technique later became known as the Parthian shot. It confused opponents and often lured them into dangerous positions. Through tactics like these, Parthian forces proved extremely difficult to defeat. Over the decades, their kingdom expanded westward, Seleucid control over the eastern provinces weakened, and one by one, these regions passed into Parthian hands. By the 2nd century BCE, the Parthians had grown into a major power. Under a king known as Mithridates I, their territory expanded dramatically. Mesopotamia itself eventually came under Parthian rule. Cities that had once belonged to the Seleucid Empire now acknowledged Arsacid kings. Once again, the Iranian Plateau stood at the center of a powerful state. Yet the Parthians were not isolated rulers. Their lands lay between great civilizations. To the west, the Roman Republic was expanding across the Mediterranean world. To the east, the Han Empire ruled China. Between these two powers, trade routes began to flourish. Caravans traveled across Central Asia, carrying silk from China, glassware from Rome, precious metals, spices, and textiles. The network of routes connecting these regions would later become famous as the Silk Road, and the Parthian Empire stood at its center. Merchants passed through Parthian territories. Taxes were collected. Markets grew in importance. Cities such as Ctesiphon, near the Tigris River, became major centers of trade and administration. Yet the presence of the Parthian Empire between Rome and the Eastern world also created tension. Roman leaders soon realized that controlling trade routes across the Near East could bring immense wealth. But to do so, they would have to confront the Parthians. And the Parthians, with their fast cavalry and deep knowledge of the terrain, would prove to be one of the most formidable opponents Rome ever faced. The clash between these two powers would shape the politics of the region for centuries, and one of the most dramatic moments in that rivalry would soon unfold on the plains of Mesopotamia, where a Roman army, confident in its strength, would encounter the devastating tactics of Parthian cavalry. The battle would become legendary, and it would forever change how Rome viewed the power of the East. Across the western frontier of the Parthian Empire, another great power had been expanding. This power came from the lands surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. It was the Roman Republic. Over the centuries, Rome had grown from a small city into a vast political force. Its armies marched across Italy, then across Greece, and eventually into the eastern Mediterranean. Roman generals believed their disciplined legions could defeat almost any opponent. They had conquered powerful kingdoms, defeated rival states, and established Roman authority across wide territories. But east of the Euphrates River, a different kind of opponent awaited them: the Parthians. Unlike the infantry armies Rome was accustomed to fighting, the Parthians relied on mobility. Their warriors rode swift horses across open plains. Their archers carried composite bows capable of striking targets at long distances, and their heavily armored cataphracts could deliver powerful cavalry charges. In the year 53 BCE, a Roman leader named Marcus Licinius Crassus decided to invade Parthian territory. Crassus was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. He had already achieved political success, yet he desired something more: military glory, victories that would match those of other famous Roman commanders. So he gathered a large Roman army and marched eastward. The campaign began with confidence. Roman legions crossed into Mesopotamia, expecting to confront an enemy similar to those they had faced before. But the landscape of Mesopotamia presented new challenges. Wide open plains stretched across the horizon. There were few forests, few hills, few natural obstacles. For cavalry armies, this terrain offered enormous advantages. The Parthians understood their land well, and the Parthian king sent one of his most capable commanders to meet the Roman invasion. His name was Surena. Surena came from one of the most powerful noble families of the Parthian Empire. Though still relatively young, he was already known for his leadership and strategic skill. When the Roman army advanced deeper into Mesopotamia, Cyrus prepared his forces carefully. Rather than confronting the Romans immediately, he waited, studying their movements, choosing the terrain that would favor his cavalry. Eventually, the two armies approached each other near a place called Carrhae. Today, this location lies in southeastern Turkey, but in ancient times, it stood along important trade routes connecting Syria and Mesopotamia. As the Roman army advanced across the plain, they expected a traditional battle. Roman legions were heavily armed infantry. They fought in tight formations, their shields locked together. Their discipline and organization had defeated many enemies before. Yet the Parthian army fought differently. When the battle began, waves of Parthian horse archers rode across the open land. They stayed at a distance from the Roman lines, drawing their bows, releasing arrows, again and again. The arrows struck shields and armor. The Roman soldiers attempted to advance, but each time they moved forward, the horse archers simply rode away, then turned again and continued firing. The tactic repeated endlessly. Dust rose from the plain. The sun grew hotter as the day continued. Roman soldiers found themselves under constant attack. Yet their enemy remained difficult to reach. Whenever Roman units attempted pursuit, the Parthian riders retreated quickly. Then, while still riding away, they twisted their bodies and released arrows behind them. This famous maneuver became known as the Parthian shot, and it proved devastating. Meanwhile, Cyrus kept another force in reserve, the heavily armored cataphracts. When Roman formations weakened, these cavalry units advanced, their long lances lowered, their armored horses charging with great force. The combination of archers and heavy cavalry gradually overwhelmed the Roman army. Confusion spread through the ranks. Attempts to regroup failed, and as evening approached, the situation had become desperate. Crassus attempted negotiations with the Parthian commanders, but the meeting ended badly. Ancient sources describe chaos and misunderstanding during the encounter. Soon afterward, the Roman leader was killed. The invasion had collapsed. For Rome, the defeat at Carrhae was shocking. An entire Roman army had been destroyed far from home. Several Roman standards, the sacred eagle banners of the legions, had been captured by the Parthians. In Roman culture, losing these standards was a deep humiliation. News of the disaster traveled slowly back across the Mediterranean. When it finally reached Rome, the impact was profound. The Roman Republic had faced many challenges before, but the power of Parthian cavalry had revealed a new kind of enemy, one that could not easily be defeated through traditional Roman tactics. For the Parthians, the victory reinforced their position as one of the dominant powers of the ancient Near East. Their empire now stood firmly between the Mediterranean world and the great civilizations of Asia. Trade continued along the Silk Road. Caravans moved through Parthian lands, and Roman leaders began to approach the eastern frontier with far greater caution. Yet the rivalry between Rome and Parthia would not end here. Over the centuries that followed, both empires would clash repeatedly along their shared borders. Cities would change hands. Armies would march across Mesopotamia, and the balance of power would shift again and again. But the Parthian Empire itself, strong though it had become, would eventually face new internal challenges, because power shared among many noble families could also create division. And in the centuries ahead, a new dynasty from the Persian heartland would rise, a dynasty that would claim to restore the ancient traditions of Iran. The rulers of that new empire would call themselves the Sassanids. For centuries, the Parthian Empire had ruled across the Iranian Plateau. Its kings governed from cities along the great rivers of Mesopotamia. Caravans traveled across its lands, and its cavalry armies guarded the frontiers against foreign invasion. Yet beneath this outward strength, internal tension slowly grew. The Parthian system of government was unusual. Power did not belong entirely to the king. Instead, several noble families shared influence across the empire. These families governed large territories, maintained their own armies, and often acted with considerable independence. At times, this structure allowed the Parthian state to remain flexible. But it also created instability. Rivalries between noble houses sometimes weakened the authority of the central ruler. And in distant regions, local leaders began to seek greater autonomy. One of these regions lay in the south of the Iranian Plateau, a land known as Persis. This area roughly corresponds to the province of Fars in modern Iran. It was here, many centuries earlier, that the first Persian kings had risen under the Achaemenid dynasty. Even after the fall of that ancient empire, the memory of Persian greatness remained strong among the people of this region. Local traditions preserved stories of earlier kings, of Cyrus, of Darius, of the vast empire that had once ruled from Persepolis. Within Persis, a local noble family held authority over the region. Among them was a man named Ardashir. Ardashir was the son of a local ruler, but his ambitions extended far beyond the borders of his homeland. From an early age, he strengthened his position among neighboring communities. He gathered supporters, built alliances, and gradually expanded his influence across the surrounding territories. During the early 3rd century CE, the Parthian Empire itself was facing increasing difficulties. Conflicts among noble families weakened central authority. Regional rulers grew more independent. In this atmosphere, Ardashir saw an opportunity. He began a campaign to expand his power beyond Persis. City after city fell under his control. Local rulers either joined his cause or were replaced. Eventually, Ardashir's growing power attracted the attention of the Parthian king. At that time, the empire was ruled by Artabanus IV. A confrontation between the two leaders became inevitable. The decisive encounter occurred around the year 224 CE. Ardashir's forces met the Parthian army in battle. Details of the conflict remain limited in surviving records, but the outcome was clear. Artabanus was defeated, and with his defeat, the long rule of the Parthian dynasty came to an end. Ardashir now stood as the new ruler of the Iranian world. But he did not present himself merely as another king. Instead, he declared the beginning of a new dynasty, the Sassanid dynasty. This name came from Sassan, a revered ancestor of Ardashir's family. And through this connection, the new rulers claimed legitimacy rooted in ancient Persian traditions. Ardashir adopted an important title, Shahanshah, meaning King of Kings. This title had been used by earlier Persian emperors during the Achaemenid age. By reviving it, Ardashir signaled something powerful: the restoration of Iranian imperial authority. Unlike the decentralized system of the Parthians, the Sassanid rulers pursued a more centralized model of government. Royal authority became stronger. Provincial administration was reorganized, and the court of the king became the center of political life. The Sassanid kings also emphasized cultural revival. Ancient Iranian traditions were celebrated. Royal imagery often depicted rulers receiving authority from divine figures. Stone reliefs carved into cliffs showed scenes of royal triumph. One such relief still survives today at Nakshi Rustam, near the ruins of Persepolis. In these carvings, Ardashir is shown receiving the royal diadem from Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrian belief. The message was clear. The king ruled not only through political power, but through divine legitimacy. Zoroastrianism itself became closely linked with the new state. While earlier Iranian societies had practiced many religions, the Sassanid rulers gave special prominence to the Zoroastrian priesthood. Fire temples were supported, religious texts were preserved, and the faith became an important element of imperial identity. Under the Sassanids, Iran once again stood as a powerful empire. Its territories extended across Mesopotamia, across the Iranian Plateau, and toward Central Asia. The capital shifted between several cities, but one of the most impressive lay along the Tigris River, Ctesiphon. There, a magnificent palace complex rose above the river plain. Its great arch, known today as the Tak Kasra, became one of the largest brick structures of the ancient world. Merchants from distant lands passed through its markets. Scholars gathered in its courts, and the rulers of the Sassanid Empire governed a realm that once again rivaled the great powers of the age. Yet another empire stood across the western frontier: Rome. The rivalry between Persia and Rome had already begun during the Parthian era. Under the Sassanids, that rivalry would grow even more intense. Armies would march repeatedly across Mesopotamia. Cities would change hands, and the balance of power between East and West would shape the politics of the ancient world for centuries. But the first great Sassanid king, Ardashir, had already achieved something remarkable. He had restored Iranian imperial rule, revived ancient traditions, and laid the foundations for a new empire that would endure for more than 400 years. The story of that empire, and its long struggle with Rome, would soon become one of the defining chapters in the history of Persia. Persia and Rome. Across the western frontier of the Sassanid Empire, another great power stood. For centuries, the lands surrounding the Mediterranean Sea had been dominated by Rome. What had once been a republic governed by senators had gradually transformed into a vast imperial state. Roman emperors ruled territories stretching from Britain to North Africa to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. Their armies were disciplined, their roads connected distant provinces, and their cities became centers of administration and culture. Between Rome and Persia lay the region of Mesopotamia, a land shaped by the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, fertile plains, ancient cities, and trade routes linking east and west. Whoever controlled these lands held an important strategic advantage. For this reason, Mesopotamia often became the stage for conflict between the two empires. Under the early Sassanid rulers, Persia sought to restore the prestige of ancient Iranian kingship. Ardashir had already challenged Roman authority along the frontier, but it was his son, Shapur I, who would become one of the most formidable rulers of the Sassanid dynasty. Shapur inherited both ambition and opportunity. The Roman Empire during this period faced internal difficulties. Emperors rose and fell rapidly. Civil wars sometimes weakened central authority, and distant provinces were not always easy to defend. Shapur recognized these vulnerabilities. During the 3rd century CE, he launched several campaigns toward Roman territories. Persian armies advanced across Mesopotamia. Cities changed hands. Fortresses were captured, and Roman forces struggled to maintain stability along the frontier. One of the most remarkable events in this long rivalry occurred in the year 260 CE. At that time, the Roman Emperor Valerian personally led an army eastward. His goal was to confront the growing power of the Sassanid state. The two forces eventually met near the city of Edessa. Ancient accounts suggest that the Roman army was already weakened by disease and logistical difficulties. Yet Valerian still attempted to negotiate with the Persian king. And what happened next stunned the ancient world. The Roman emperor himself was captured. It was an event almost without precedent. Never before had a Roman emperor been taken prisoner by a foreign ruler. Persian relief carvings later commemorated the victory. One famous scene carved into stone shows Shapur on horseback. Before him, the Roman emperor kneels in submission. Whether the image reflects literal events or symbolic representation, its message was unmistakable. The Sassanid Empire had achieved a dramatic triumph. For the Romans, the defeat was deeply humiliating. But the struggle between the two empires did not end with this moment. Instead, it continued for generations. Roman armies would later recover some territories. New emperors reorganized the eastern defenses, and the frontier between the two powers shifted repeatedly. Yet, despite their conflicts, the relationship between Persia and Rome was not defined only by war. Trade continued across their borders. Merchants crossed frontier cities. Goods from distant lands passed through markets on both sides. Silk from the east, glassware from the Mediterranean, spices, metals, and textiles. These exchanges reminded both empires that their worlds were deeply connected. Within the Sassanid realm itself, culture flourished during this era. Royal courts supported scholars. Craftsmen produced intricate metalwork. Silver plates and bowls decorated with hunting scenes became famous throughout the region. Textile workshops created luxurious fabrics, and Persian artistic styles influenced cultures far beyond the plateau. The court also maintained strong ties with Zoroastrian religious institutions. Priests preserved sacred traditions. Fire temples remained important spiritual centers, and religious festivals marked the rhythm of life across many communities. Over time, the Sassanid Empire grew into one of the most sophisticated states of the late ancient world. Its administration organized large territories. Its armies guarded the frontiers, and its culture helped shape the intellectual life of the region. Yet, history never remained still for long. Across the deserts of Arabia, new forces were slowly gathering. Tribes that had long lived beyond the borders of great empires were beginning to change. Trade networks expanded across the Arabian Peninsula. Religious ideas spread between communities. And within a few centuries, a new movement would emerge that would transform the entire Near East. When that moment arrived, both Rome and Persia would face a challenge unlike any they had encountered before. But for now, the Sassanid Empire remained strong. Its kings ruled from magnificent courts. Its armies guarded the ancient frontier with Rome, and its civilization stood as one of the great powers of the late antique world, a power whose cultural achievements would leave a lasting mark on history. By the 6th century, the Sassanid Empire had already existed for several hundred years. Its kings ruled from great cities along the Tigris River. Its armies defended vast frontiers, and its culture had begun to influence many regions across the Near East. Yet the empire still faced challenges. Internal rivalries sometimes weakened royal authority. Wars with the Roman Empire drained resources, and the administration of such a large realm required constant attention. It was during this time that a ruler appeared who would reshape the empire in lasting ways. His name was Khosrow. History would later remember him as Khosrow I, or by another name often used in Persian tradition, Anushirvan, meaning the immortal soul. Khosrow came to power in the year 531 CE. At the beginning of his reign, the empire faced instability. Several rebellions had emerged, and economic conditions required reform. Rather than relying only on military strength, Khosrow focused on rebuilding the foundations of the state. One of his first priorities was administrative reform. Taxation across the empire had previously been inconsistent. Some regions contributed more than others. Records were incomplete, and corruption sometimes affected local officials. Khosrow introduced a more systematic approach. land surveys were conducted. Agricultural productivity was measured. Taxes were calculated more evenly across provinces. These changes helped stabilize the economy. Farmers gained greater clarity about their obligations, and the royal treasury became more reliable. Khosrow also reorganized the military. The empire's frontiers stretched across deserts, mountains, and river plains. Each region required different strategies for defense. So military command was divided into several regional zones. Generals were assigned responsibility for specific areas. Fortifications were strengthened along vulnerable borders. This system improved the empire's ability to respond to external threats. But Khosrow's achievements were not limited to administration and warfare. His reign also became known for intellectual and cultural development. During this period, one institution gained particular importance: the Academy of Gandhi-Shapur, located in southwestern Iran. Gandhi-Shapur became a remarkable center of learning. Scholars from many regions gathered there: Greek physicians, Syriac translators, Indian mathematicians, Persian scholars. Together they studied medicine, philosophy, astronomy, and literature. Texts from different traditions were translated and preserved. Ideas moved between cultures. Knowledge that might otherwise have disappeared was carefully recorded. Many historians later described Gandhi-Shapur as one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. Within its halls, physicians studied the human body. Astronomers observed the movements of the stars. Philosophers debated questions about nature and knowledge, and students learned from teachers whose traditions stretched across continents. Beyond the academy, daily life in the Sassanid Empire continued to evolve. Cities expanded, markets filled with merchants and travelers. Caravans carried goods across long-distance trade routes. The Silk Road remained active, connecting Persia with Central Asia and China. In the royal court, ceremonies reflected the grandeur of imperial power. Ambassadors arrived from distant lands, bearing gifts, precious fabrics, jewels, and rare animals. These diplomatic exchanges reinforced Persia's role as a central hub in the networks of the ancient world. Art and craftsmanship also flourished. Metal workers produced finely detailed silver vessels, often decorated with scenes of royal hunts or mythological imagery. Textile workshops created intricate fabrics that traveled far beyond Persian borders. Even the games played by the elite reflected cultural exchange. One such game arrived from India during Khosrow's reign. It was known as Chaturanga. Over time, it evolved into the game now called chess. Another game, known today as backgammon, was also refined within Persian courts. These games became symbols of strategic thinking and intellectual skill. Yet, despite the prosperity of this period, the Sassanid Empire still existed within a complex political environment. To the west, the Roman world had transformed into the Byzantine Empire. Its capital stood in the city of Constantinople, and its rulers continued to compete with Persia for influence across the Near East. Diplomacy sometimes maintained peace between the two powers, but tension never completely disappeared. Border conflicts erupted periodically. Armies gathered along frontier fortresses, and each empire watched the other carefully. Still, during the reign of Khosrow I, Persia experienced a remarkable period of stability and cultural achievement. Reforms strengthened the administration. Learning flourished. Trade expanded, and the empire reached one of the highest points in its long history. Yet history is often shaped by cycles. Periods of stability can be followed by new challenges. After Khosrow's reign, the balance between Persia and Byzantium would once again shift. Future rulers would launch ambitious campaigns. Wars would grow larger, and the resources of both empires would slowly be exhausted. Few people living in the peaceful cities of Persia at that time could have imagined what was coming, because beyond the deserts of Arabia, a new force was beginning to rise, one that would soon transform the political and religious landscape of the entire region. Across the vast deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, life moved according to rhythms very different from those of the great empires to the north. The landscape itself shaped this way of life: endless stretches of sand, rocky plateaus, and scattered oases where water allowed small communities to survive. For centuries, many of the tribes who lived in Arabia traveled across these lands as nomads. They moved with their herds, crossing long distances between wells and grazing grounds. Some tribes settled in towns that grew along important trade routes. Caravans traveled between southern Arabia and the Mediterranean world, carrying incense, spices, leather, and textiles. Among these towns, one held particular importance: the city of Mecca. Mecca stood along one of the major caravan routes of western Arabia. Merchants gathered there. Pilgrims visited a sacred sanctuary known as the Kaaba. Different tribes brought their traditions and beliefs to the city. Arabia during this time was home to many religious practices. Some communities worshipped local gods. Others followed forms of Judaism or Christianity. Ideas traveled with merchants and travelers across the desert roads. In the early 7th century, a new religious movement began to emerge in this environment. It centered around a man named colon, content reference open bracket, OAI cite colon, 0, close bracket open brace index equals 0 close brace. Muhammad was born in Mecca around the year 570. He worked as a merchant in his early life, traveling with caravans, observing the cultures and religions that existed across the region. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad later received revelations that formed the foundation of a new faith. This faith would become known as Islam. At first, the movement attracted only a small group of followers, but its message spread steadily. It emphasized devotion to a single God, moral responsibility, and unity among believers. Over time, tensions grew between Muhammad's followers and some of the powerful groups in Mecca. Eventually, Muhammad and his supporters migrated to another city, Medina. This journey, known as the Hijra, marked an important turning point. From Medina, the new religious community continued to grow. Within a few years, many tribes across Arabia began to accept Islam. By the time of Muhammad's death in 632, much of the Arabian Peninsula had united under this new faith. Meanwhile, to the north, the great empires of the region were facing their own difficulties. The Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire had fought long and exhausting wars against each other. Armies marched across Syria, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Cities were damaged, resources were drained, and populations suffered from years of instability. These conflicts weakened both empires. When new Arab armies began to move northward, the political landscape had already become fragile. After Muhammad's death, leadership of the Muslim community passed to a series of rulers known as caliphs. Under these early caliphs, Arab forces expanded beyond Arabia. They moved into territories once controlled by Byzantium and Persia. The campaigns unfolded with surprising speed. In 636, one of the most important confrontations occurred. Near a place called Al-Qadisiyah, Sassanid forces attempted to stop the Arab advance, but the battle ended in defeat for the Persian army. Soon afterward, Arab forces captured the city of Ctesiphon, the magnificent capital of the Sassanid kings, the royal palaces, the great arch of Takhasra, and the treasuries that had accumulated wealth for centuries. all passed into new hands. Yet the Sassanid state did not collapse immediately. Resistance continued in several regions. Persian forces regrouped, and new battles were fought. The final decisive confrontation came a few years later, near the city of Nahavand in western Iran. The battle took place in 642. Arab armies once again defeated the Sassanid forces. Later, historians sometimes refer to this event as the Victory of Victories, because it effectively ended organized resistance from the Sassanid state. The last Sassanid ruler fled eastward, moving from city to city, seeking support among remaining loyalists. But the empire that had once stretched across vast territories was no longer able to recover. Eventually, Yazdegerd was killed in 651. With his death, the Sassanid dynasty came to an end. For the first time in more than 1,000 years, the Iranian Plateau was no longer ruled by a native imperial dynasty. Yet the story of Persia did not end here. Arab rulers now governed the region. Arabic became an important administrative language. Islam gradually spread across Iranian society. But something remarkable soon occurred. Instead of disappearing, Persian culture adapted. Languages evolved. Old traditions blended with new religious ideas. And over time, Persian scholars, poets, and administrators would play central roles within the Islamic world. Once again, the civilization of Iran would transform itself, absorbing change and preparing for a new chapter in its long history. After the fall of the Sassanid Empire, the Iranian Plateau entered a new historical era. Arab armies now controlled the region, and the expanding Islamic world connected lands stretching from Spain to Central Asia. For the people of Persia, this transformation brought profound changes. Arabic became the primary language of administration and scholarship. Islam gradually spread through cities and rural communities, and many Persian nobles and administrators began serving within the new Islamic political structures. At first, Persians were often treated differently within the early Arab-led states. Those who converted to Islam but were not of Arab origin were known as Mawali. In some regions, they experienced social and political limitations. Yet, over time, Persian communities adapted. They entered positions of influence. They served as administrators, scholars, and advisors. Gradually, the cultural exchange between Arab and Persian societies began to deepen. This process accelerated during the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th century. The Abbasids came to power in the year 750. Their revolution had been supported by many groups across the eastern provinces, including large numbers of Persians. The new Abbasid capital was established in Baghdad, a city built not far from the former Sassanid capital of Ctesiphon. From this location, the caliphate governed a vast realm, and Persian administrators soon became central to its bureaucracy. Families such as the Barmakids served as influential ministers. Their knowledge of governance helped shape the administrative systems of the Abbasid state. Persian court traditions also began to influence the culture of the caliphate. Ceremonial practices, architecture, literature. These elements blended into the developing civilization of the Islamic Golden Age. Within this environment, intellectual life flourished. Libraries expanded. Scholars translated ancient works from Greek, Syriac, Sanskrit, and Persian. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy. These disciplines advanced through cooperation between scholars from many cultures. Persian thinkers played an important role in this intellectual movement. Living during the 10th and 11th centuries, Avicenna studied medicine, philosophy, and science. His works on medicine would later influence physicians across the Islamic world and medieval Europe. He traveled widely, studying astronomy, geography, and the cultures of distant lands. His writings demonstrated an extraordinary curiosity about the natural world. Yet, the revival of Persian identity was not limited to science and scholarship. Language itself became a powerful symbol of cultural renewal. During the centuries following the Arab conquest, the Persian language gradually evolved. It absorbed Arabic vocabulary, adopted a modified Arabic script, and developed into a new literary form known as New Persian. This language allowed Persian poets and writers to express their ideas while remaining part of the broader Islamic civilization. One of the most important patrons of Persian culture emerged in Central Asia, the Sassanid dynasty, ruling from cities such as Bukhara during the 9th and 10th centuries. The Sassanids encouraged the use of Persian language and literature. Under their patronage, poetry flourished. Writers explored themes of history, heroism, and identity. Among these poets, one name would become legendary. Ferdowsi lived during the 10th century. He devoted decades of his life to composing a monumental epic, the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. This vast poetic work told the story of Iran from mythological beginnings to the fall of the Sassanid dynasty. Its verses preserved ancient legends, stories of heroic warriors, wise kings, and dramatic struggles between good and evil. But the importance of the Shahnameh went beyond storytelling, by writing in Persian rather than Arabic. Ferdowsi helped ensure that the language of Iran would survive and flourish. His poetry became a cornerstone of Persian cultural identity. Even today, more than 1,000 years later, its verses remain widely known, recited in gatherings, studied in schools, and remembered as one of the greatest literary achievements in world history. As Persian language and culture revived, new dynasties also emerged across the Iranian world. Some were ruled by Persian families, others by Turkic warriors who had migrated into the region. Yet, even when these rulers were not ethnically Persian, they often adopted Persian culture. Persian became the language of administration and literature across many courts. Poets traveled between cities, scholars exchanged ideas, and Persian traditions shaped the political culture of much of the Eastern Islamic world. In this way, Persia once again demonstrated a remarkable ability. The ability not only to survive conquest, but to influence those who conquered it. Empires changed, languages shifted, religions spread. Yet the cultural heart of Iran continued to endure. And as centuries passed, this enduring tradition would shape new kingdoms across Central Asia, India, and the Middle East. The Persian Renaissance had begun, and its influence would echo far beyond the mountains and deserts where it first emerged. Across the wide grasslands of Central Asia, another movement of peoples was beginning. These lands stretched far beyond the northeastern frontiers of the Iranian Plateau. Open steppes, rolling hills, and vast skies where nomadic tribes had traveled for generations. Among these tribes were groups known collectively as the Turks. For centuries, Turkic communities had lived as pastoral nomads. They moved with their herds of horses and sheep, crossing enormous distances between seasonal pastures. Their societies valued mobility, skill in riding, and the ability to survive in difficult environments. These qualities made Turkic warriors formidable soldiers. Over time, some of these groups migrated southward and westward, entering regions already connected to the Islamic world. As they encountered Persian and Arab societies, many Turks adopted Islam, and gradually they began to establish their own political power. One of the most important Turkic dynasties to emerge during this period was the Seljuk dynasty. The Seljuks originated from a Turkic clan that had moved from the Central Asian steppes into the lands of Iran. During the 11th century, their power expanded rapidly. Seljuk armies advanced across Persia and Mesopotamia. Cities that had once belonged to earlier dynasties now recognized Seljuk authority. Eventually, Tukrul entered the city of Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. There, he was recognized as protector of the Caliph. This event marked an important turning point. The Seljuks became the military power behind the Abbasid Caliphate. Yet, although the Seljuk rulers were of Turkic origin, the culture of their empire became deeply Persian. This transformation occurred for practical reasons. The Persian administrative system had long experience managing complex states. Persian scholars and officials already served within Islamic governments. So, Seljuk rulers relied heavily on Persian administrators. Nizam al-Mulk served as the chief minister of the Seljuk state. His administrative skill helped stabilize the empire during its expansion. He organized government institutions, managed relations with regional governors, and developed policies that strengthened the authority of the central court. Nizam al-Mulk also founded a network of educational institutions known as madrasas. These schools provided training in law, theology, and administration. Students from across the Islamic world studied there, and many later became scholars or officials within the empire. Through these institutions, Persian intellectual traditions continued to shape the political culture of the region. Meanwhile, Persian literature and science flourished during this era. Poets wrote verses about love, philosophy, and the passage of time. Among them was one of the most famous figures of Persian culture. Khayyam lived during the 11th and 12th centuries. He was known both as a scientist and a poet. As a mathematician, he contributed to the study of algebra. As an astronomer, he participated in the reform of the Persian calendar. And as a poet, he composed verses that reflected on life's fleeting nature. His collection of poems, later known as the Rubaiyat, would travel far beyond Persia. Translated into many languages, admired by readers across the world. Under Seljuk rule, cities across the Iranian Plateau remained active centers of culture. Markets filled with merchants and travelers. Mosques and schools became places of learning. Caravans continued to move along the great trade routes, connecting Persia with Central Asia, India, and the Mediterranean. Despite the political changes brought by Turkic rulers, Persian language and culture remained deeply influential. In fact, many Seljuk courts conducted administration in Persian. Poetry and literature flourished in Persian, and the traditions of earlier Iranian dynasties continued to shape royal ceremony. Once again, the pattern repeated. Foreign conquerors arrived, yet over time, they adopted the culture of the lands they ruled. Persia did not simply endure, it reshaped the world around it. But the stability of the Seljuk Empire would not last forever. By the early 13th century, a new force was gathering far beyond the eastern horizon. Across the distant plains of Mongolia, tribes were uniting under the leadership of a man whose conquests would transform Eurasia. His armies would move with extraordinary speed. Cities would fall, trade routes would change, and entire civilizations would face destruction. Far beyond the eastern mountains of the Iranian world, the landscape opens into one of the largest grassland regions on Earth. The Central Asian steppe. Here, for thousands of years, nomadic tribes moved across wide open plains. Their lives were shaped by horses, by seasonal migration, and by the endless horizon stretching in every direction. Among these tribes, conflicts were common. Clans competed for grazing lands. Leaders rose and fell. Alliances formed and then disappeared. But during the late 12th century, a leader emerged who would change the destiny of these lands. His name was Temujin. History would later remember him as Temujin's early life was marked by hardship. His family struggled for survival after the death of his father. For many years, he lived on the margins of tribal society, but through determination, strategic alliances, and remarkable leadership, he gradually united many of the Mongol tribes. In the year 1206, a gathering of tribal leaders proclaimed him Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. Under his command, the Mongol tribes transformed into one of the most formidable military forces the world had ever seen. Their armies moved with extraordinary speed. Every warrior was a skilled horseman. They carried powerful composite bows, and they could travel vast distances across difficult terrain. Communication between units was efficient, command structures were disciplined, and tactics emphasized mobility and coordination. At first, Mongol expansion focused on nearby regions of Central Asia, but soon their attention turned toward the wealthy cities of the West. Caravan routes connecting China with the Islamic world passed through these lands. Merchants traveled across deserts and mountains, bringing silk, spices, precious metals, and ideas from distant civilizations. The Iranian world stood at the center of these trade networks, and its cities had grown prosperous through commerce and learning. One of the states controlling these lands during the early 13th century was the Khwarezmian Empire. Its territory stretched across much of Central Asia and Iran. At first, relations between the Mongols and the Khwarezmian rulers were peaceful. Genghis Khan even attempted to establish trade relations. He sent merchants and diplomats westward. But events soon took a disastrous turn. In one city along the frontier, a Mongol caravan was attacked. Merchants were killed, goods were confiscated. When Genghis Khan demanded justice, the Khwarezmian ruler refused. For the Mongol leader, this was an unforgivable insult. And so, the Mongol armies began to move west. What followed became one of the most devastating invasions in the history of Eurasia. Beginning around 1219, Mongol forces crossed into the cities of Central Asia. Their movements were swift, their coordination precise. Cities that resisted were often destroyed. Walls were breached. Defenses collapsed. And news of the advancing armies spread fear across the region. Stories traveled faster than the armies themselves. Travelers spoke of cities erased in a single week, of towers built from the skulls of defeated enemies, of entire regions suddenly silent. For many people in Persia, the Mongols seemed less like an army and more like a natural disaster. Soon, the Mongols entered the Iranian Plateau. Some of the great cities of the Persian world faced terrible destruction. Places that had once been centers of scholarship and trade were suddenly caught in the path of war. Cities such as Nishapur and Merv suffered enormous devastation. Libraries burned, markets fell silent, and many of the irrigation systems that sustained agriculture across the plateau were damaged. The Qanat channels that carried water beneath the desert earth, structures built over generations, were abandoned or destroyed. For many communities, life changed almost overnight. Caravan routes were disrupted, urban populations declined, and the political order that had governed the region collapsed. Yet the Mongol Empire itself continued to expand. Genghis Khan's armies pushed farther west, across Persia, toward the Caucasus, and eventually into parts of Eastern Europe. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire stretched across enormous territories from northern China to the Caspian Sea. But the Mongol world did not remain unified forever. After his death, the empire was divided among his descendants. Several regional khanates emerged, and the lands of Persia became part of a new Mongol state. This state would later be known as the Ilkhanate. At first, the Mongol rulers of Persia remained culturally distinct from the populations they governed. Their traditions came from the steppe. Their language and customs differed from those of the Persian cities. Yet over time, something remarkable began to happen. Just as earlier conquerors had done, the Mongol rulers slowly began to adopt the culture of the lands they ruled. Persian administrators helped manage the state. Persian scholars wrote histories of the new dynasty, and the courts of the Ilkhanate gradually became centers of Persian art and learning. Within a few generations, many Mongol rulers themselves adopted Islam. Persian language became widely used in administration and literature. Once again, the pattern repeated. A conquering power arrived from distant lands. Yet, over time, the civilization of Persia reshaped the empire that ruled it. Many believed Persian civilization had finally been destroyed, but once again, it would return. Even after the devastation of invasion, the cultural resilience of the Iranian world continued. Cities slowly recovered, trade routes reopened, and Persian scholars once again began recording the long story of their civilization, a story that had endured conquest after conquest, and that still had many chapters yet to unfold. After the first wave of Mongol conquest, the Iranian Plateau entered a period of profound transformation. As cities that had once been vibrant centers of trade and scholarship were rebuilding, communities slowly returned to abandoned towns. Farmers restored irrigation systems. Caravans cautiously resumed their journeys across the great trade routes. Above these recovering lands, a new political structure had formed. The Mongol Ilkhanate. He had been sent westward by the Mongol imperial court to consolidate control over the lands of Persia and the Middle East. Under his command, Mongol forces captured several major cities. Among the most dramatic events of this campaign was the fall of Baghdad in 1258. For centuries, Baghdad had been one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world. Its libraries, its scholars, its markets, and its institutions of learning had made it a center of intellectual life. But when Hulagu's army arrived, the city's defenses collapsed. The Abbasid Caliphate that had ruled from Baghdad for 5 centuries came to an end. With the fall of Baghdad, the Mongol Ilkhanate became the dominant power across Persia and much of the surrounding region. At first, the Mongol rulers remained culturally distinct from the populations they governed. Their traditions were rooted in the steppe. They followed different customs, spoke different languages, and maintained the social structure of Mongol aristocratic clans. Yet governing a complex region like Persia required knowledge that the Mongols themselves did not possess. They needed administrators, scholars, tax collectors, and officials who understood the long-established systems of Iranian governance. So gradually, Persian administrators were brought into positions of authority. Rashid al-Din served as a vizier in the Mongol court during the late 13th and early 14th centuries. He was both a statesman and a scholar. Recognizing the importance of preserving knowledge, he oversaw the creation of one of the most ambitious historical works of the medieval world, a vast chronicle known as the Jami al-Tawarik, the Compendium of Chronicles. This work recorded the histories of many civilizations: Persia, China, the Mongols, India, and the lands of Europe. It reflected the interconnected world that had emerged under Mongol rule. Trade networks expanded dramatically during this era. Historians often refer to this period as part of the Pax Mongolica, a time when Mongol authority created relatively secure routes across much of Eurasia. Merchants traveled from China to the Mediterranean. Caravans carried silk, spices, paper, precious stones, and scientific ideas across continents. Persia stood at the crossroads of these exchanges. Cities such as Tabriz became important commercial centers. Markets filled with goods from distant lands. Travelers from Europe encountered merchants from Central Asia, and diplomatic envoys crossed territories that had once been separated by great distances. Meanwhile, Persian culture continued to shape the court life of the Ilkhanate. architecture flourished. New cities were built. Mosques and madrasas rose above expanding urban landscapes. Artistic traditions blended Mongol, Persian, and Chinese influences. Manuscripts were illustrated with vivid miniature paintings. These artworks depicted historical events, court ceremonies, and scenes from Persian literature. In 1295, Ghazan converted to Islam. This decision changed the cultural direction of the Ilkhanate. Islam became the official religion of the state. Persian administrative traditions grew even more influential, and Mongol rulers increasingly adopted the customs of the societies they governed. The descendants of the steppe warriors were becoming integrated into the Persian world. Once again, the familiar pattern appeared. Invaders arrived with overwhelming force. But over time, they were absorbed into the cultural landscape of Iran. Persian language remained the language of literature and administration. Persian scholars continued writing histories. Persian poets composed verses about kings and heroes. Despite the devastation of earlier invasions, the civilization of Persia endured. Yet the Ilkhanate itself would not last forever. Internal struggles among Mongol elites weakened the state. Regional leaders gained independence. And by the middle of the 14th century, the unified Mongol authority in Persia began to dissolve. In the decades that followed, a new conqueror would appear, a man who claimed descent from the Mongols, but who ruled with ambitions that stretched across much of Asia. His campaigns would once again sweep across the Iranian Plateau, and his name would soon become famous throughout history. Timur. During the 14th century, the political landscape of the Iranian world was once again changing. The Mongol Ilkhanate had gradually weakened. Internal conflicts divided its ruling elites. Regional governors gained independence, and the unified authority that once governed Persia dissolved into smaller states. Across many cities, local dynasties struggled to maintain stability. Trade continued along the Silk Road, but political power became fragmented. In this uncertain environment, another ambitious leader began to rise. He came from the lands of Central Asia, near the ancient city of Samarkand. His name was Timur, was born in the region of Transoxiana around the year 1336. Although he claimed descent from the Mongol legacy of his cultural environment, was already deeply influenced by Persian and Islamic traditions. From an early age, Timur demonstrated strong leadership among the tribal groups of Central Asia. He built alliances, gathered loyal followers, and gradually established control over the territories surrounding Samarkand. By the late 14th century, Timur had created a powerful military state. Like earlier steppe conquerors, his armies relied heavily on cavalry. Mounted warriors moved quickly across enormous distances. Their mobility allowed Timur to launch campaigns across wide regions, from Persia to the Caucasus, from India to Anatolia. His conquests unfolded with remarkable speed. Cities submitted to his authority. Rival rulers were defeated, and vast territories came under his control. For many regions, Timur's campaigns brought destruction and upheaval. Cities that resisted his armies sometimes suffered severe consequences. Walls were destroyed, governments collapsed, and populations were displaced. Yet Timur did not see himself merely as a warrior. He also viewed himself as a ruler, restoring order across lands that had become politically fragmented. Samarkand became the center of his empire. From there, Timur oversaw ambitious building projects. Architects constructed mosques, madrasas, and magnificent public spaces. The city gradually transformed into one of the most impressive capitals of the medieval world. Visitors described domes covered in blue tiles, grand courtyards surrounded by towering arches, and markets filled with merchants arriving from distant regions. Artisans from across conquered territories were often brought to Samarkand. Persian craftsmen, Turkish architects, Indian stoneworkers. Together, they created a distinctive artistic style that blended many cultural influences. Persian culture played an especially important role in this environment. The Persian language remained central to literature and administration. Poets composed verses celebrating royal patronage. Historians recorded the events of Timur's reign, and scholars gathered at courts across the empire. After Timur's death in 1405, his descendants continued ruling large portions of Central Asia and Persia. Their dynasty became known as the Timurid dynasty. Under the Timurids, Persian art and scholarship flourished. One of the most important cultural centers of this era was the city of Herat, located in present-day Afghanistan. Herat became famous for its libraries and workshops. Artists produced illuminated manuscripts. Calligraphers perfected elegant scripts, and miniature painters developed detailed visual storytelling within book illustrations. These miniature paintings became one of the defining artistic traditions of Persian culture. Scenes from literature, royal ceremonies, landscapes filled with gardens and palaces, all rendered with remarkable precision and color. Timurid rulers also supported scholars and scientists. Astronomical observatories were constructed. Mathematics and philosophy continued to develop. One of Timur's descendants, Ulugh Beg, became known for his contributions to astronomy. His observatory in Samarkand produced detailed star catalogs that were studied for centuries. Despite the turbulence of earlier wars, this period became a remarkable renaissance for Persian culture. Poetry flourished. Art reached extraordinary levels of refinement, and the cities of Central Asia and Iran once again became centers of intellectual life. Yet, political stability remained fragile. After the Timurid era, new powers would rise across the Iranian plateau, and eventually, a dynasty would emerge that transformed the religious and political identity of Iran forever. That dynasty would establish a state that still shapes the identity of the country today, the Safavid dynasty. At the dawn of the 16th century, the lands of the Iranian plateau were once again divided among competing powers. The Timurid dynasty had gradually declined. Local rulers governed different regions. Trade continued along ancient caravan routes, but political unity across Iran had largely disappeared. Within this fragmented world, a religious movement began to grow. Its origins lay in a Sufi brotherhood founded centuries earlier in the city of Ardabil. This spiritual order became known as the Safaviya. Originally, the Safaviya had been a mystical religious community. Its followers gathered around spiritual leaders who taught devotion and discipline. But over time, the movement gradually changed. It attracted warriors and tribal supporters. Many of them came from Turkic tribes who had migrated into the region. These followers became known as the Shizilbash, meaning the Redheads. The name came from the distinctive red headgear they wore as a symbol of loyalty. The leader who transformed this spiritual movement into a political force was a young man named Ismail was still a teenager when he began gathering supporters among the Kizilbash tribes. Despite his youth, he possessed remarkable charisma. Warriors across the region pledged loyalty to him, believing him to be both a spiritual guide and a rightful ruler. In the year 1501, Ismail marched toward the city of Tabriz. His followers defeated rival forces, and when he entered the city, he declared himself Shah of Iran. With this moment, the Safavid dynasty was born. Yet Ismail did something even more significant. He declared that Twelver Shia Islam would become the official religion of the state. This decision transformed the religious identity of Iran. At that time, Most of the surrounding regions followed Sunni Islam. By establishing Shia Islam as the foundation of the Safavid state, Ismail created a distinct identity for his kingdom. Religious scholars were invited from across the Shia world. New institutions were established. Mosques and schools taught Shia theology. Over time, this religious transformation reshaped Iranian society. The Safavid Empire expanded rapidly during Ismail's early reign. Persian cities recognized his authority, and the Iranian plateau was once again unified under a single dynasty. But powerful neighbors soon challenged Safavid power. To the west stood the Ottoman Empire, one of the largest Sunni empires of the time. The Ottomans viewed the rise of a Shia state with concern. Tensions between the two powers eventually led to open conflict. In 1514, the armies of the Ottoman Sultan confronted Safavid forces at the Battle of Chaldiran. The Ottomans possessed advanced artillery and firearms, technologies that the Safavid forces had not yet fully adopted. During the battle, the Safavid army was defeated. The Ottomans briefly occupied the city of Tabriz. Although the Safavid state survived, the defeat revealed the importance of military modernization. Future Safavid rulers would learn from this experience, and over the decades that followed, they strengthened the institutions of the state. Despite these early challenges, the Safavid Empire continued to grow. Iran once again became a major center of culture and commerce. Caravans crossed deserts and mountains, carrying goods between India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world. Cities expanded, markets flourished, and Persian art entered a new period of creativity. Carpet weaving became one of the most celebrated crafts of Safavid Iran. Workshops produced intricate designs using silk and wool. These carpets traveled across international trade networks, reaching palaces and homes far beyond Persia. Ceramic artisans developed elegant blue and white pottery. Metalworkers crafted decorative objects for royal courts, and architects designed mosques and palaces that reflected the beauty of Persian geometry. Yet the greatest cultural flowering of the Safavid age was still to come, because during the late 16th century, a powerful ruler would rise, a ruler who transformed Iran into one of the most magnificent states of the early modern world. He would move the capital to a new city, fill it with gardens, bridges, palaces, and markets. Under his leadership, the Safavid Empire would reach the height of its power and cultural brilliance. During the late 16th century, the Safavid Empire entered a new phase of transformation. Earlier, rulers had unified Iran and established the foundations of a powerful state. But the empire still faced serious challenges. Powerful tribal groups competed for influence. Foreign rivals threatened the borders, and the structure of the military required reform. It was during this period that rose to power. Abbas became Shah in 1588. At the time, he was still very young. Yet, over the following decades, his leadership would reshape the Safavid Empire in lasting ways. One of his first priorities was the reorganization of the military. Earlier, Safavid armies had relied heavily on the Qizilbash tribal warriors. Although loyal, their power sometimes created instability within the state. So, Shah Abbas began forming a new military structure. Soldiers were recruited from diverse backgrounds. Some were converted slaves trained for military service. Others were professional infantry equipped with firearms. Artillery units were also expanded. These changes created a more centralized army, one loyal directly to the Shah. With this strengthened military, Abbas was able to stabilize the frontiers of the empire. He negotiated peace with the Ottoman Empire to the west, and then gradually regained territories that had previously been lost. Trade routes became safer. Caravans once again crossed the Iranian plateau. But Shah Abbas understood that political stability required more than military power. He wanted to create a capital that reflected the wealth and beauty of the empire. For this purpose, he chose a city in central Iran, Isfahan. In 1598, Shah Abbas moved the Safavid capital there. What followed was one of the most ambitious urban projects of the early modern world. Isfahan was transformed. Wide boulevards were constructed. Gardens filled with flowing water appeared across the city. Bridges crossed the Zayandeh River. Markets expanded, and magnificent architectural complexes rose above the skyline. At the center of this new city stood a vast public square. Today, it is known as Nakshi Jahan Square, meaning image of the world. The square was enormous, large enough for polo matches and public ceremonies, surrounded by arcades and elegant buildings. At one end stood the Shah Mosque. Its turquoise domes shimmered in the sunlight. Its entrance portal rose high above the square, covered in intricate geometric tiles. Nearby stood the Sheikh Lotfola Mosque, smaller, but famous for its delicate interior decoration. Across the square stood the Ali Kapu Palace. From its balconies, the Shah could observe events in the plaza below. Merchants sold carpets, silks, spices, jewelry. Travelers from distant lands walked through the bizarre corridors. The city soon became one of the most vibrant centers of commerce in the region. European visitors who arrived during this period often expressed amazement. They described Isfahan as one of the most beautiful cities they had ever seen. Persian writers sometimes used a poetic phrase for it. Nesfe Jahan, half the world, because they believed that seeing Isfahan was like seeing half the wonders of the world. Trade flourished under Shah Abbas. The empire sat at the crossroads between East and West. Merchants from India brought textiles and spices. Caravans from Central Asia carried horses and precious metals. European traders arrived seeking silk. Armenian merchants were encouraged to settle in a district of the city known as New Julfa. There, they built churches, homes, and commercial networks that connected Safavid Iran with global trade. Artistic life also flourished during this golden age. Persian miniature painting reached extraordinary levels of refinement. Artists illustrated manuscripts with delicate scenes of gardens and courtly life. Calligraphers produced elegant works of writing. Carpet weaving became an internationally celebrated craft. Safavid carpets were admired for their intricate patterns and vibrant colors. Many were exported to distant courts and palaces. Throughout the empire, cities prospered. Roads were improved. Caravanserais provided shelter for travelers, and the Safavid state enjoyed a period of relative stability and prosperity. Yet even during this golden age, new challenges were slowly emerging. Powerful empires surrounded Safavid Iran. The Ottomans remained a formidable rival. In the east, new political movements were rising, and within the Safavid court itself, future succession struggles would eventually weaken the dynasty. For now, however, the city of Isfahan stood as a symbol of Persian creativity and ambition. Its domes, its gardens, and its lively bazaars reflected a civilization that had once again risen to remarkable heights. But the Safavid Golden Age would not last forever, and the centuries ahead would bring new conflicts and transformations to the land of Iran. After the Golden Age of Shah Abbas the Great, the Safavid Empire slowly began to lose its strength. For many years, the empire had stood as one of the great powers of the Middle East. Its cities were prosperous. Its markets were busy with merchants from distant lands, and its capital, Isfahan, had become one of the most beautiful cities of the early modern world. Travelers who visited the city often spoke of its wide avenues, its turquoise domes, its gardens filled with flowing water. and the vast royal square surrounded by mosques and palaces. Yet, behind this beauty, the foundations of Safavid power were beginning to weaken. The rulers who followed Shah Abbas lacked his energy and discipline. Many spent their lives inside the royal court, far removed from the realities of governing a vast empire. Court officials and palace factions began to compete for influence. Political intrigue replaced strong leadership, and over time, the authority of the central government declined. In distant provinces, governors gained greater independence. Some regions became difficult to control. Tribal groups that had once supported the Safavid state pursued their own ambitions. The empire still appeared strong from the outside, but inside, its political structure had grown fragile. Trade routes still crossed the Iranian Plateau. Caravans still arrived at the bazaars of Isfahan. Silk merchants negotiated with traders from India and the Ottoman world. Yet the flow of commerce was no longer as vibrant as it had once been. Roads became less secure. Local conflicts disrupted travel, and the wealth that had once filled Safavid treasuries slowly declined. Meanwhile, dangerous challenges were emerging beyond the borders of the empire. To the west, the Ottoman Empire remained a powerful rival. Ottoman armies continued to compete with Persia for influence across Mesopotamia and the Caucasus. To the east, another threat was beginning to grow. In the mountainous regions of Afghanistan, tribal confederations had long resisted Safavid authority. Among them were the Ghilzai tribes. For many years, relations between these tribes and the Safavid governors of the region had been tense. Local disputes grew into wider conflicts. Eventually, one Afghan leader rose to challenge the empire directly. His name was Mahmud. Mahmud led the Ghilzai tribes in open rebellion. His forces captured important towns in eastern Iran. Safavid officials attempted to respond, but the empire no longer possessed the military strength it once had. The rebellion spread rapidly. Afghan forces moved westward across the plateau. City after city fell under their control, and soon, the road to the Safavid capital lay open. In the year 1722, Mahmud's army approached the city of Isfahan. The capital that had once been called half the world now faced one of the darkest moments in its history. The Afghan forces surrounded the city, and the long siege began. Inside the walls of Isfahan, life gradually became more difficult. At first, the city still possessed stores of food and supplies, but as weeks turned into months, those supplies began to disappear. Markets emptied, prices rose, and hunger spread through the population. The once busy streets of the capital grew quiet. The great square that had hosted royal ceremonies and polo matches stood silent. Many residents fled when they could. Others remained trapped within the city walls. The Safavid ruler at that time, Shah Sultan Hussein, struggled to respond to the crisis. His court lacked unity, his armies were disorganized, and attempts to break the siege failed. As winter approached, conditions inside the city grew even worse. Food became scarce. Disease spread among the weakened population, and the morale of the defenders collapsed. After many months of suffering, the inevitable finally occurred. Shah Sultan Hussein surrendered the city. Mahmud and his Afghan forces entered Isfahan. The Safavid dynasty, which had ruled Iran for more than 2 centuries, had effectively come to an end. For the people of Persia, the fall of the Safavid state created a period of deep uncertainty. Political authority collapsed. Different groups struggled for power. Some regions attempted to govern themselves. Others fell under the control of foreign forces. Trade routes became dangerous once again, and the once unified Iranian state fragmented into competing territories. Yet, even during this chaotic period, new leaders began to emerge. Among them was a man whose life had begun far from royal courts and imperial palaces. He was born into a humble family in northeastern Iran. His childhood was shaped by hardship. He experienced poverty, conflict, and the instability that had spread across the land. But he also possessed remarkable determination. As he grew older, he joined local military groups. Through skill and courage, he gained the loyalty of soldiers. Step by step, he rose through the ranks. Eventually, he would command armies, drive invading forces from Persian lands, and restore the power of Iran. His name was Nader, and the world would soon come to know him as Nader Shah, a ruler whose campaigns would once again make Persia a force feared across Asia. In the years after the collapse of the Safavid dynasty, Iran entered a period of confusion and instability. The once powerful empire had fragmented. Foreign forces moved across its borders. Afghan rulers controlled the former Safavid capital, and local warlords struggled to claim authority across the provinces. For many communities across the Iranian Plateau, life became uncertain. Trade slowed along caravan routes. Cities that had once prospered now faced economic hardship, and the memory of Safavid stability began to fade. Yet amid this turmoil, a remarkable figure began to rise. His name was Nader. He was born around the year 1688 in the northeastern region of Iran known as Khorasan. Unlike many rulers of earlier Persian dynasties, Nader did not come from a royal family. His childhood was shaped by hardship. His father died when he was young, and for a time, his family lived in poverty among nomadic tribes of the region. But these difficult circumstances also shaped his character. From an early age, Nader learned how to ride, how to survive in harsh landscapes, and how to fight. As a young man, he joined bands of warriors that operated along the frontiers of northeastern Iran. The region was often threatened by raids and conflicts. Military skill was essential for survival. Nader quickly developed a reputation for courage and leadership. Over time, he gathered loyal followers and gradually built a small but disciplined force. During this same period, the Safavid royal family attempted to regain control of Iran. One of the surviving princes, Tahmasp, claimed the throne. But the young ruler lacked the strength needed to defeat the Afghan forces occupying much of the country. It was during this struggle that Nader first entered the larger stage of Iranian politics. He offered his military support to Tahmasp, and together, their forces began a campaign to drive the Afghans out of Iran. Nader's leadership proved decisive. His armies moved quickly across the eastern provinces. Several important battles followed, and gradually, the Afghan occupation collapsed. In 1729, Nader's forces defeated the Afghan ruler Ashraf in a series of battles that restored Iranian control over large parts of the country. Cities that had been lost returned to Persian authority. The road to Isfahan reopened, and hope for the restoration of a strong Iranian state began to grow. Yet Nader was not satisfied with partial success. He continued campaigning across the region. Foreign armies that had taken advantage of Safavid weakness were pushed back. Ottoman forces withdrew from several territories, and Iranian authority slowly expanded once again. By this time, it had become clear that Nader himself held the real power. Although Tahmasp technically remained Shah, the army followed Nader's commands, and the future of Iran increasingly rested in his hands. Eventually, the arrangement could not continue. In 1736, a great assembly of tribal leaders and military commanders gathered on the Mughal plain. During this gathering, Nader was proclaimed the new ruler of Iran. He took the title of Shah, and with this moment, a new dynasty began, the Abbasid dynasty. Nader Shah quickly demonstrated that his ambitions extended far beyond the restoration of Iranian territory. He reorganized the army, strengthened discipline among the troops, and launched campaigns across Central Asia and the Caucasus. Yet his most famous campaign would lead him even farther east, toward the wealthy Mughal Empire of India. At that time, the Mughal state still possessed enormous riches. Its capital city, Delhi, was one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the world. In 1739, Nader Shah led his army across the mountains into northern India. The Mughal forces attempted to resist, but Nader's disciplined troops defeated them at the Battle of Carrhae. Soon afterward, his army entered Delhi. For a brief moment, the conqueror from Persia stood at the center of one of the richest empires of the age. During this campaign, Nader Shah acquired immense treasure. Among the most famous objects taken from India was the legendary peacock throne, a magnificent royal seat decorated with jewels and gold. He also carried away several famous diamonds, including stones that would later become known throughout the world. The wealth transported back to Iran was extraordinary. Caravans carrying treasure crossed deserts and mountains on the long journey home. For a time, this immense wealth strengthened Nader Shah's power. Taxes were reduced, the army was rewarded, and Iran once again appeared strong under a powerful ruler. Yet, as the years passed, Nader Shah's rule grew increasingly harsh. Continuous military campaigns exhausted the country. Heavy demands were placed on soldiers and subjects alike. Suspicion and fear spread within the royal court. The ruler, who had once restored Iranian strength, became increasingly isolated. In 1747, after years of warfare and internal tension, Nader Shah was assassinated by members of his own circle. With his death, the empire he had built quickly fragmented. Yet his legacy remained remarkable. From humble origins, he had risen to become one of the most formidable military leaders of his era. He had expelled foreign invaders, reunified Iran, and briefly restored Persian power across vast regions of Asia. But as history would show once again, the stability of Iran rarely depended on a single ruler alone. After Nader Shah's death, new dynasties would emerge, and the long story of Persia would continue into the modern age. After the death of Nader Shah, Iran once again entered a period of uncertainty. The empire he had built did not survive long after him. Regional leaders competed for control. Different dynasties rose and fell across the Iranian plateau. For many decades, political stability remained fragile. Eventually, a new dynasty emerged, the Qajar dynasty. During the late 18th century, the Qajar rulers established their authority over much of Iran. They chose a city near the foothills of the Alborz Mountains as their capital, Tehran. At the time, Tehran was still a relatively modest town. But under Qajar rule, it gradually grew into the political center of the country. Yet the world around Iran was changing rapidly across Europe. Industrialization was transforming economies and military power. Large empires were expanding their influence across Asia, and Iran found itself caught between two powerful neighbors, the Russian Empire to the north and the British Empire to the south. Throughout the 19th century, these foreign powers competed for influence in Iranian affairs. Diplomatic pressure, trade agreements, and military confrontations reshaped the political landscape. Several wars between Iran and Russia ended in territorial losses for the Qajar state. Regions in the Caucasus that had once been part of the Persian world were permanently separated. For many Iranians, these events were deeply painful. They marked a moment when an ancient civilization had to confront a rapidly modernizing world. Yet, inside the country, new ideas were beginning to spread. Merchants, scholars, and intellectuals began discussing reform. Some called for stronger institutions, Others demanded limits on royal authority. These conversations eventually led to an important turning point. In 1906, Iran experienced one of the earliest constitutional movements in Asia. Protesters gathered in cities, clerics, merchants, students. All demanded a new political system. The result was the creation of a parliament and the introduction of a constitution. For the first time, Iran formally experimented with representative government. The 20th century would bring even more dramatic change. In 1925, a military officer named Reza Khan rose to power. He soon became known as Reza Shah. Under his leadership, Iran entered a period of rapid modernization. Railways were constructed, new schools were opened, and the central government expanded its authority across the country. In 1935, the government officially asked the international community to refer to the country as Iran rather than Persia. The name Iran, meaning land of the Aryans, reflected the ancient heritage of the Iranian people. Reza Shah's rule reshaped many aspects of society, but it was also authoritarian. Political opposition was limited, and the state maintained strong control over public life. During the Second World War, foreign powers once again intervened in Iranian affairs. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate. His son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, became the new ruler. For several decades, Iran experienced rapid economic development. Cities expanded, industries grew, and oil revenues transformed the economy. Yet social tensions also increased. Many people felt that political freedoms were limited. Economic inequality grew, and resentment toward foreign influence remained strong. By the late 20th century, these tensions reached a breaking point. In 1979, a revolutionary movement spread across the country. Mass demonstrations filled the streets, the monarchy collapsed, and a new political system emerged, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since that moment, Iran has continued to navigate the complex challenges of the modern world. Political debates, international tensions, and social change continue to shape the country's future. Yet, when we look across the entire arc of Persian history, something remarkable becomes clear. For more than 2,500 years, and this land has experienced countless transformations. Empires have risen and fallen. Foreign armies have arrived. New religions have spread. Dynasties have disappeared. Yet the cultural memory of Persia has never truly vanished. Its language endured. Its poetry endured. Its traditions of art and scholarship endured. Even conquerors who once ruled these lands often adopted Persian culture themselves. In many ways, the history of Iran is not only the story of kings and battles, it is the story of continuity, of a civilization that repeatedly reshaped itself across centuries of change. And perhaps this is the most remarkable part of the story. Civilizations often disappear when empires collapse, but Persia never truly vanished. Instead, it adapted. It absorbed new ideas, new peoples, new beliefs, and each time it continued forward. If we step back and reflect on the long journey we have taken together tonight, from the ancient cities of Elam to the empire of Cyrus the Great, from the golden domes of Isfahan to the modern streets of Tehran, we begin to see a civilization defined not only by power, but by endurance. The mountains of the Iranian Plateau still stand. The deserts still stretch toward distant horizons. And across those landscapes, the long memory of Persia continues. Now, as our journey through these centuries comes to an end, the story gently fades back into silence. The cities grow quiet. The caravans disappear into the night, and history slowly drifts into rest. Thank you for traveling through this long story of Persia. And if you enjoyed this peaceful journey through history, you are always welcome to return again. For now, let the past grow distant and allow yourself to rest.